Hey, kid. Yeah, come here for a sec. Do you need a new spot to buy your camera equipment? You know, someplace far away from the prying eyes of the NYPD, the FBI, the HUAC, the CIA, the DEA, the JRK, the GNS, the HRT, the KAR, and the FTC? You know, are you tired of trying to score lenses and film stock from geriatric parents whose attempts at a hobby didn't work out? But look, I got exactly the store for you, okay? Go on down to 186th and 60th Avenue. In the sub-basement beneath the liquor store, you're gonna look for Arlo Arrows Video Emporium. They specialize in everything from high 8 to Kodachrome, from 70mm down to just little point and shoots. All the equipment is freshly borrowed from 420 9th Avenue. You know where that is. And it's completely untraceable to you. And if you happen to be a client with a particular taste, you can go even deeper to the sub-basement and visit Benjamin Baer's Pyrotechnics Institute. Benjamin can teach you to blow up a pipeline, how to communicate with burst transmitters, evade the law, and successfully create your own off-the-grid republic free of any non-groovy participants who are going to kill the vibe. Listen to this. Mapping the Zone listeners can whisper the secret code 24FPS and they can get an 8% discount of any Tupperware purchase. Can you dig on that? Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion to the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts here.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
And this week we are going to be going over chapters 10 and 11 of Vineland. We are down Cody this week, so it'll just be the three of us, but hopefully everything should be all four of us for the rest of what we need to record. I believe there's no other random scheduling conflicts have come up. But that being said, we'll dive right in. Will, do you have a summary for us as usual?
As usual, it seems like I do.
Exciting.
When Prairie lays eyes on DL and Takeshi's office suite in the beginning of chapter 10, she's ambivalently surprised. First by the exterior's utter normalcy, but then by the vast technological paradise within. DL warns her that it's more bark than bite, before she is violently made aware by the appearance of a designer seltzer dispensing robot named Raoul. Prairie recaps her understanding of the current state of affairs, and after some teasing, the trio speed off to the home of Ditsa Pisk Feldman, an old comrade of 24FPS who ended up with the film archives from the good old days. In watching the tapes, commentated by Ditsa and DL, Prairie starts to nearly literally see from her mother's perspective. She sees how her mother maneuvered the small-time publicity her work had garnered, how the team worked with and against their goals despite the utter devotion they all held, and eventually how her relationship, first professional, with Bond had began. Despite the flirting having been kept off tape, even DL, commenting back then, saw the beginnings of what was to come between them. At some point, the narrative moves to an unshot flashback, and we follow 24FPS down to a provincial college, up Schitt's Creek, and are warned they may be trapped for the time being. The College of the Surf lied between the Marine Base Camp Pendleton and the coast, nearer San Diego. Though eventually revealed as a flipped pump-and-dump scheme, it began as quite the hippie hothouse. Its initial plans to be a quiet technical college were nigh instantly startled when a sequence of riots broke out over some students smoking probably communist cannabis cigarettes out in the quad. The conveniently named Atman, weed, was chosen as prophet thanks to his local altitude and therefore excellent perspective on nearby police brutalities mid-riot. The lackadaisical mathematics prof was happy to fall in with the revolutionary set, at that point figureheaded by a devotee of the BLGVN, Rex Novel. He saw the Leninist government in exile as a representative of some amalgamation of the violently progressive spirit and kept in contact with them. Rex had tried to coach Weed on his political views, and the man listened but was hardly interested in speechification himself. Regardless, momentum built, and the quiet mathematician came to represent the spirit of the burgeoning People's Republic of Rock and Roll. The secession was inspired by the publicization of the Land Development Plan, and the name was chosen for its immortality. 24 FPS were the premier documentarians of the event. Before long, Frenesi was entangled not just with Brock Vond, but also Atman. Vond's access is at first purely principled, only provided thanks to the openness intrinsic to the 24 FPS ethos. As time went on, though, the earlier dark jokes were proven prophetic. She flies to Oklahoma to meet with him for obscure purpose and soon learns that it's business. He rambles on about his secret communications with the PR3 avatar, supposedly using her body as the medium. She can't help but chalk it up to a bizarre expression of homophobia. He extrapolates further, claiming a desire for Weed's spirit, but not his body. After a long while and a consummation of the betrayal, Frenesi watches Vaughn's resting body and dreams of the innocent boy he must have been at his core. She leans to whisper some of them to his unconscious ear, but suddenly finds him awake and laughing.
All right, thank you as always, Will. So let's just go over impressions of the chapters. What did you guys think of 10 and 11?
So both these chapters are kind of, I feel like, transitional chapters. You know, the 10 kind of wraps up the them escaping the um compound. I'm blanking on the word. Chapter
The
9 being the
Ninjet
chapter 9,
retreat.
the Ninjet retreat. Exactly. So that it kind of wraps up that wraps up that little storyline. Transitions Prairie and the rest of them to LA. Um, I think Prairie stays in LA for a while, I want to say. And chapter 11 kind of we get the backstory of Weed Atman. Um, and we finally get introduced to the College of the Surf and the People's Republic of Rock and Roll, which seems to kind of um it's another flashback, but I think that I want to say that storyline continues into chapter 12. I could be wrong about that, but these two chapters do seem kind of transitional and seem to be kind of more backstory, giving us backstory for the characters. It doesn't, I don't feel like either of these chapters is going to be anyone's favorite chapters from the book, although I could be wrong about that.
Hmm.
Um, there is stuff to love in here. I mean, we'll go over it, but like the kind of cyberpunk robot that serves Prairie, designer Seltzer is pretty cool. We do get introduced to a lot of the other members of 24 FPS, which is interesting. Um, I found that pretty fun to read. Um, and yeah, I mean the chapter 12 or chapter 11 is a pretty cool snapshot of the 60s, and I do like how Nixon obsessed it is. Yeah, I mean I enjoy these chapters. They're not, like I said, they're not my favorite, but there's stuff to like in here.
That is for sure. Will, what about you?
Yeah, I guess I like it more than you. I'm not saying that you dislike it, but I find that both chapters pretty engaging on a more lighthearted wavelength for the most part than the previous chapters. Uh, there's a lot of cultural critique that goes on in these chapters, and in terms of like actual plot, like you said, Luke, it is mostly like connective tissue. It is pulling things together. It's giving you, okay, who the hell is this Weed Atman guy anyway? Why is he a Thanatoid? What? Okay, what is this connection here? It's bringing all of that stuff together, and on that level, I find it very satisfying to read. But it really doesn't have a lot going on beyond the cultural criticism and some character development. But I still enjoy most of it, and when it has kind of the tonal downturn towards the end of chapter 11,
Hmm.
it's effective. I think doesn't mean it's fun, doesn't mean I like it per se, but it is it's effective.
I think you have to be in like a really tough position in life to like the ending of chapter 11 or find it fun. You're going through some pretty dark shit if that's your takeaway from that chapter. Yeah, I guess I lie somewhere in the middle between you guys, or have different elements of both of the things you've said that I would apply to my impression of the chapter. That on first glance, I've actually probably enjoyed these two chapters more than any of the others so far. I'll be curious if that, lasts past this week as we start to read the next section of the book, or if that'll still be my answer at the end of the book. But it's quite possible that it will be. I think the other part of it too is I want to say the two chapters that we've read so far for the show that have the most jokes or comedic elements to it. I'm struggling to think of any other two chapters that are next to each other, and either Mason and Dixon or Crying of Lot 49 that you could say are as consistently funny, at least to me, that these two chapters are. And it's also the first time, I want to say in 2 years, that a book I've been reading has made me cry. Just the way that chapter 11 ends, and specifically the way that Pynchon writes that ending, which I'm sure we'll get to once we progress to that point in the podcast, is just nothing short of incredible to me, and just so head and shoulders above like any other character work that he's written in any one instance in his career to this point, when you're looking at it from publication date. And yeah, it's such a interesting mix of connective tissue, like both you, Will, and you, Luke, have said, but it also provides some degrees of resolution rather, to the things that we've already been talking about and the things that we've been wondering through the book. Because one of the big questions sort of behind the scenes through the first 9 chapters is like, why did Frenesi leave for Brock? Like, how did that even happen? Like, none of this makes any sense. We've very much been in the same position as Prairie up until now in our understanding of that relationship and our desire to want to understand why it started in the first place. So it's sort of a mixture of both, in the sense that it is connective tissue. It is pushing the plot to like the next physical location it's going to be in. But I think it's also emotionally resultive as well. Yeah. So does anyone have anything they want to add before we just go into chapter 10 proper?
So I did bring this up, I think, a week or two ago, and I think it was cut from the final recording just because it didn't go anywhere. But I did have a question for y'all. Are Takeshi and DL in a relationship, like a romantic relationship, in the future, like in the 1994 timeline?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's like an interpretative angle where it's not, I wouldn't call it romantic, but I think that there are some people who would consider it romantic in the same way that you might consider any sort of like platonic life partnership romantic.
Yeah.
But that's as far as I'd go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. It's an open question in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely not explicit. I don't think it's ever made explicit either way, which makes me lean towards it not being a thing. But I was just wondering.
I do definitely see what you're talking about, in the sense that it does seem as though Takeshi is still just as, like, it still has as much desire to sleep with her again as he did in the flashback sequences when they were first together. Like, there is certainly that undercurrent to a lot of their interactions from, I think, Takeshi's side, which could easily be bent into like they are currently in a romantic relationship, pretty easily. So I see what you mean, as far as it not being necessarily completely resolved as far as what the answer would be. Like, I could definitely come away from some of those interactions with a different opinion, I think.
You could even maybe frame it as like a parodic inversion of like people who get married because they have the
Tax
physical
breaks.
attraction, Well, like, have physical attraction and then like have kids, or just due to like happenstance, it's just easier to stay together than it is to get a divorce.
Oh, sure.
I don't, because I mean, I believe it's been well over the year. It's been quite a while.
Oh, yeah,
They're working
absolutely.
together because they want to work together at this point.
Yeah.
Either that, or they just really screwed up the karmic readjustment in the first place. But I mean, I think that they are like emotionally intimate with one another just due to time spent. So I think that, you know, if you consider platonic, intimate relationships romantic, like some people do, you know, sure. I'm not sure I would call it a romantic relationship, though.
Yeah, sounds good. That answers my question more or less.
Yeah. I think Will said it incredibly well. So that being said, yeah, chapter 10 opens up on them leaving, and there are multiple like very cyberpunk aspects to like the first 2 pages. Not just the fact that there is the seltzer robot that Will mentioned in his recap, which I love, but also that they have a special type of paint on their car that makes it seem as though the car is not actually there, and that you're just sort of looking at another patch of highway or road or wherever you happen to be. It's just so perfectly reflective. Um, what do we think? I wanted to ask this question a few weeks ago, and just it escaped my mind at the time. What do we think about the cyberpunk elements of this book? Do we have any thoughts as to their inclusion or the reasoning behind their inclusion? Is it just sort of that's the character that kind of Pynchon is wanting DL and Takeshi to sort of embody that sort of those tropes from cyberpunk, or do we think there's something else going on there?
In my grand unified reading of all of Pynchon's novels, except for the ones I haven't read, I would say that it is broadly a kind of a reiteration of the way that his early books are focused on the way that normal life had become integrated with the concepts of cyberpunk. And cyberpunk literature, you know, is focusing on the potential end results of these social shifts. But Pynchon's works have always been almost hyper focused on the way that those same themes are implicated in everybody's life, from the beginnings of modernity, and kind of intensified but also normalized at the point of Vineland in the mid 80s.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything that I could add to that. That's very well said, Will.
So I was wondering if there's anything to be drawn from the way that this chapter talks a lot about, not talks a lot about, but there is a lot of stuff with regard to acronyms. And the first time we see that is with the YSL logo on a can of soda water.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I was thinking about honestly over the past couple of days, and then especially today as I reread the chapters again. Because there are like an inordinate number of acronyms in these 2 chapters. And I don't know if it has something to potentially do with just the way that like we organize ourselves as people and in the world is often in these kind of bite-sized categories that we often further reduce to, you know, literally like letter acronyms as far as how we sort out like where we belong or where we're from, or, you know, who we can trust and who we can't trust. And obviously chapter 11 has to do with, I'll be generous and say, nation building. And immediately like that starts out of the formation of the ad hoc committee. So I think there could be something to do there about human classifications and organization systems, and you know the different ways in which we draw those lines between one another. And certainly from a standpoint of rich versus poor, something like YSL being a sort of boutique fashion designer company would feed into that. But beyond that, I can't really say that if that holds any real water for the novel, or if there's a better explanation for why they might be all over the place.
Well, I mean, this might be a stretch, but in the 60s counterculture and even in movements. Like you shorten Black Lives Matter to BLM a lot of the time. Whenever you refer to local police departments, you're going to say like DPD for Dallas PD and stuff. And in the 60s, the FBI and the CIA um, would have been seen as some of the main enemies of the counterculture. And I do think that the use of acronyms is in some ways connected to the counterculture in the US. Like I said, that may be a bit of a stretch, but I do think that acronyms probably came up a lot more for people just in general who are more of the countercultural bent than people who are more square or more mainstream, if that makes sense. Some dude working an office job and with a wife and 3 kids and a white picket fence in the 60s wasn't going to be using acronyms all the time. But a Black Panther might have been using acronyms a little bit more than the other example I just used, if that makes sense.
Yeah, at the same time, it makes me wonder. I think the middle class absolutely kind of insulated itself from that sort of thing, or even the working classes and the middle class kind of insulated themselves from that kind of culture. But I think maybe it's more of like maybe not education, but kind of a social stratification relationship. Because like when I think about who uses a lot of acronyms, especially back in the 80s, I think of like boardrooms just as much as I think of like hippies. And back in the 60s too, even like you think about all the acronyms in like Boeing manuals and stuff, just to bring that in.
Yeah, I think pensions work as a technical writer and I like the corporate thing as well. But pensions work as a technical writer probably did make him encounter a lot of acronyms. And I mean, acronyms are a big thing in Gravity's Rainbow too. There's all the different permutations of the CIA with different meanings for C and I and A and Gravity's Rainbow, and acronyms are something that Pynchon uses throughout his books, and especially in Gravity's Rainbow, and maybe I think to a lesser degree in Vineland, but still a lot in Vineland. He uses acronyms a fair amount. So
Yeah, true. I mean, we were talking about UBI just a couple of weeks ago when Prairie started cooking at the retreat. So yeah, it does seem to have come up quite a bit, at least in this book, if not previous ones, because I made the joke about the LED. So it does seem to be just kind of maybe a feature of his writing that we're starting to take notice of and try to drill down into.
Yeah, I think on the most basic level, it's just a joke, but
Yeah.
it might build up to more of like a commentary on like how how language shapes our thoughts and the ways in which the 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 People's Republic of Rock and Roll and all similar revolutionary organizations, as much as you want to call that one revolutionary, are seeded with or sown with the seeds of their own demise, right?
Yeah, the blooming bureaucracy of 3-letter organization. Yeah, a great point. I mean, but who can really say that the People's Republic of Rock and Roll wouldn't work? It's the one thing that they knew would never die. The one thing that would last.
I'm listening to rock and roll in 2024. I don't know about the rest of you.
yeah, it did it because I'm not saying rock and roll is dead by any means, but it's definitely not. There's not like all these mainstream rock bands, blowing up the radio charts like they were in the '60s.
Its kids are in middle age.
Yeah.
How dare you both slander Imagine Dragons like that?
Oh God. I dreaded the day that Imagine Dragons came up on this podcast. I used to sit around being like, it can't happen. It won't happen.
It did. It finally did. They
And-
found us.
And now we must acknowledge that we are sponsored by Imagine Dragons.
That'd be big money right there. That's the streaming money.
What a cadre of sponsors this show has. We truly only sign the best in our field.
We take globalization to another, more dimensional level.
That's for sure. I will say honorable mention to the joke of the seltzer water being in a YSL styled can. My perfume is Saint Laurent, and the way Pinchon describes the seltzer can doesn't sound too dissimilar from the the glass jar that my perfume comes in. So imagining that same jar but a little bit larger and with sparkling water in it instead of a vaguely pinkish liquid was something that truly made me laugh, probably harder than Pinchon would have expected anyone to laugh. But it was the first moment in these two chapters where I was like, all right, what am I really in store for here?
Well, what you're in store for is a hint at a time machine.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. As well as DL describes the one of the machines that is falling victim to planned obsolescence, a tachyon something, if I remember correctly, which is a Star Trek reference. I'm gonna find the quote now.
Yeah, I have it. Just had to R&R another tachyon chamber, DL amplified. Exactly a tenth of a second after the warranty ran out. The sucker blew. Why, they call it a time machine, I guess.
Yeah, like that. First of all, that joke about planned obsolescence being a time machine is pretty hilarious. But especially coming on the heels of something that I don't think was widely talked about in the 90s. Planned obsolescence, I feel like, didn't really become a topic of public conversation until maybe even like 5 years ago. But especially coming after a Star Trek reference to the warp drive that the USS Enterprise like runs off of. That was just it's such a remarkably pleasing two sentences in this book from a standpoint of the layers that Pynchon is capable of creating.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of weird how planned obsolescence has gone mainstream.
Uh-huh.
I don't think I've mentioned this on this podcast. I did make some Reddit posts about it a year or two ago. But I did teach Byron the Bulb to high school like juniors or seniors who are taking dual credit classes. They're technically college freshmen. It's technically a college freshman class. And I assigned a short like paragraph, 2 paragraph essay thing about planned obsolescence, not really expecting them to be so well versed in it or to really know what it was. Just because I thought it was more of like a, 20s or 30s thing, but or upwards. But yeah, they were very, very well versed in it, and especially as it relates to like iPhones and iPhone batteries that came up super consistently.
Mhm.
Um, but that does seem to be a thing that Pynchon, there are some through lines as I was just talking about, and as we've talked about between Gravity's Rainbow and this novel, where some of his obsessions seem to kind of recur. Um, and this book does seem to be, like Pynchon more than a lot of authors seems to kind of have his little like pet subjects and his little things that kind of recur throughout his books, which I do like.
Yeah, agreed. I think if I remember correctly, there was like a pretty high profile lawsuit against Apple in particular about, I think it was their batteries or just multiple different components in their phones that resulted in a lot of people getting free replacements for batteries or new phones. And I want to say that was like five years
I
ago.
think you're right. I think it was 2018.
Yeah, so that would make sense why some younger kids definitely have more of an understanding of it. But when it's become so pervasive in like culture that there are memes on like Instagram or TikTok about plant obsolescence, that there's really no secret anymore in the way that it's sort of mentioned in Vineland as a vaguely conspiratorial concept.
Yeah, that's late stage capitalism for you, I guess.
That's for sure.
One thing I do like about this page is just how straight like it's played. The robot is played because even like nowadays, if somebody like I went over to somebody's house and they had like a mini fridge on wheels that could talk to you, it would be pretty surprising. But this is 1984. I do love how nobody's like, Prairie doesn't seem surprised or freaked out by it. It's just they're all just kind of accept it,
Hmm.
um, which I like a lot. And I mean, it's probably not impossible for that kind of technology to be around in the 80s. I guess. I mean, the video screens are maybe a bit much in terms of the size of that kind of stuff
Yeah, the
at that
voice
time, but
activation.
does have
Yeah,
voice activation? Yeah.
the communication between the human user would require some level of at least like AI to recognize pre-coded phrases or things like that.
Yeah, that's true. Um, but yeah, it's not treated as like some like monumental like,
Oh, it's
oh my
just
God, you have
there.
yeah.
Like, of course you have a robot seltzer dispenser. Why wouldn't you? Designer seltzer dispenser.
I guess nothing would surprise you after you get in a car that's invisible.
Yeah, that's fair. Or when she met this woman, she was scanning for a strange iridescent business card using a handheld computer.
Yeah.
And, seeing the whole ninja retreat and everything, you'd probably be pretty desensitized, just crazy shit at this point.
Yeah.
I do love though that when the robot like is done serving whoever called it, it goes back into its charging port singing I'll see you again and drink drink drink, because those are like two very different songs. Um so the idea that it sings that in either combination or one after the other was another moment that made me laugh.
So I guess point of clarification is the tachyon chamber and time machine talk, is that a joke told by the characters? Because that's how I
That
read it.
that was how I read it too, rather than anything serious. I think that potentially like the time machine comment, because earlier a similar comment was made when DL and Takeshi were recounting their menage a trois between the two of them, or menage a deux. They used the same phrase, like referencing places they'd been or memories. So it's possible that since they're back in LA, they're just saying like, oh, we just took another trip in the time machine, but our time machine's broken because the like machine that kept the car invisible didn't work anymore or something like that.
Well, I also think it's thematically in line with the rest of the chapter, because the rest of
Very
the
true.
chapter is Prairie especially, but all of them watching footage of the 60s and kind of, Prairie. It's mentioned that Prairie kind of feels like she's like in Frenesi's body back then, whenever Frenesi is shooting the footage that they're watching.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I get kind of annoyed with people who go into like the holiness of video recordings and how it's like a time machine and stuff. But it is kind of true where it does kind of, there are some time machine aspects of watching a movie that's set in the past, that's period accurate, where it does kind of return you or take you to a world that's different than yours and is not necessarily accessible to you on a daily basis.
Well, and that's an effect that's even more so amplified when like the people in the film, and like it's not a home video in the sense that Prairie's related to them, but like seeing her mother, who she is certainly related to, and then understanding that DL was also involved in this project, I feel like would even further port you there for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's it's particularly resonant to me at the moment because just around the new year, a friend and I went to go visit a native pueblo for one of their ceremonies, and nothing ended up happening. Didn't end up making it there, but that was the intention. And to read this chapter as the return to normalcy, I guess, very
Mm-hmm.
resonant. Because if anyone's unaware, the whole if anyone's ever heard of photos stealing souls, let's not get into that because it's a much subtler subject. But that's those are the people who kind of brought that idea into vogue, and I get the sense that that's something that Pynchon holds a lot of tide with, given the
Yeah,
way he talks about film in this book and then in Against the Day.
obviously I can't vouch for Against the Day, but I definitely see what you're talking about within this book, which the subject of their destination and the time machine does bring us to the introduction of Ditsa Pisk Feldman, who is just her, and really everybody in FPS. I think is some of the funniest like band of misfits humor that Pynchon has done in the books that we've read for this show so far, but just especially when it recounts the way that she and her partner talk about New York as if the only relocating they'd ever done was physically. That whole scene and everything with this character just made me, again, it was another moment where I was just really like full on laughing out loud in my reading.
Yeah, I really like the way that there's kind of this. It's funny to call it a natural counterpoint because these are both books written by the same author, probably intentionally making the point. But the counterpoints that this group of young revolutionaries have to the Sons of Liberty in Mason and Dixon, I think that the way that they are described, the way that the Sons of Liberty are viewed as much more sinister, is kind of telling in some way. I don't know what way, but some way.
I mean, probably telling from the standpoint of what Pynchon thinks about the founding of this country, and the people involved in it.
One thing I really like about the Ditsa introduction is the little detail that her and her sister kept plastic explosives in Tupperware containers in the icebox.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretending to be film editors, but we're really anarchist bombers. So I'm actually I don't know if all of our listeners will know this, but I mean there were in the late 60s, early 70s, there were thousands of bombings, maybe not, I mean at least hundreds of bombings done by countercultural groups. Which is something that I actually didn't know until I was doing some research for a class in grad school. The class was about the Beatles, but I was kind of off on a tangent related to just kind of the general countercultural movement. And I read some books about it. That's one thing because we think of the hippie movement as being all peace and love and peaceful protests, and not as we don't think of them as violent terrorists, typically at least. But there was kind of a terrorism aspect to the hippie movement that I think has been kind of drowned out over the years and has kind of been lost over the years. So I really like that detail, and
Mm-hmm.
I brought this up maybe our last episode, maybe the one before it, but I do find it interesting that Pynchon did have some possible connections to the environmentalist movement, and particularly the more um, action-oriented parts of the environmentalist movement, which is not confirmed. Um, but I could definitely see that little detail about keeping plastic explosives in Tupperware containers being some type of nod to somebody he knew in the 60s and 70s who was doing more environmentalist type, violence or something. That detail has really stuck out to me, even though it's kind of a throwaway line. Because she says they're pretending to be film editors, but they were actually anarchist bombers. But the rest of the chapter, they just seem to be regular members of 24 FPS,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm not sure about that. Like, I'm not sure about, he kind of contradicts himself. I could see, them using at 24 FPS as a sort of cover for their activities. There's a few different ways you can interpret that. Um, but yeah, that detail really stuck out to me.
Yeah,
And
no,
yeah,
I
the
agree.
detail about them never leaving New York City is really funny.
The best example of what Luke is talking about is an organization called the Weather Underground, that was particularly active in the 70s and claimed credit, I want to say, for like 26 or 27 bombings or something like that. There was also other elements that we would potentially consider almost terroristic in their effects from that time frame. Like, it was a pretty widely discussed plan from a lot of different communes to release LSD into the water system, thinking that would, solve all of the ills of humanity. And Pynchon kind of makes a reference to that earlier in Vineland when he's talking about the marriage between Frenesi and Zoid. There's a reference to the fact that a lot of their hippie friends were pressuring them to be the first couple to just basically feed their baby LSD in hopes that would create kind of the perfect human future that they were striving for, partially aided by the use of drugs. So just some points for people to research. The Weather Underground, a lot of associated movements like that, or where you can sort of pick up more information like what Luke is talking about. But apart from that, Luke, I do think it's interesting. I didn't really consider it until you kind of just mentioned it, but I do think it's interesting that Pynchon does provide different sort of, I don't want to use the word interpretations necessarily, but views of what 24 FPS is, because you're right, there are these two members claiming to be anarchist bombers, but they don't seem any different from anyone else in 24 FPS. The only thing we ever see 24 FPS do is just take videos of sort of countercultural movements or police brutality and protests against that, and you know, like the birth of the Republic of Rock and Roll, and yet we don't know. They could have been more than that, because a lot of those same organizations that were responsible for bombings or other types of violence would have been similarly political. That's an interesting point that I had not considered. But you're right, there are a lot of facets to that the more you think about it.
Yeah. It did kind of maybe speak to like a group inside of the group of FPS, like a secret society inside the secret society and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It also, I mean, just the mention of anarchist bombers, and then later in this chapter, I want to say they talk about light as it relates to film a lot, but both of those, anarchist bombings come up in Against the Day a lot, and the discussions of light, and it's kind of, I find it hard to pin down and talk about, but light comes up a lot in Against the Day as well. So there are, this book does seem to be kind of a connecting in different ways, like a lot of Pynchon's novels. Y'all were just talking about the Sons of Liberty.
Hmm.
We were talking about Gravity's Rainbow a bit ago. This book does seem to be kind of, it's more important to the larger Pynchon canon than I think people give it credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. So just
Yeah.
to go ahead, Will.
I was gonna. I have kind of a. I can connect a lot of things.
Connect away.
First of all, when I read that, I almost read it as, because it's framed as. When I read it saying that Prairie was told that she was pretending to be a film editor, but was actually an anarchist bomber, I see it as kind of an ambiguous statement of either, criticism of kind of hippies for being like, oh, we were so revolutionary, when all they were doing was shooting film and cutting it together. Simultaneously, the statement on that kind of whitewashing, because maybe they were bombing things, it's just that they don't document that.
Mhm.
And so all we see is the peace love nonsense, when they were actually also blowing things up. And furthermore, I just did a really quick full text search on his first 4 books. Tupperware only shows up 2 times, here and in the introduction to Lot 49.
Yeah, the Tupperware party that
Yeah,
she's leaving.
that's
So
a
I
good
th-
pull. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing a very direct comment on just the nature of domesticity and the way that maybe feminism, maybe just culture has shifted, and that ties into in the discussion of plastics and imipal XG in Gravity's Rainbow, where this plastic is simultaneously in that book a fetish object, as well as seen as the savior of humanity and the structure in which it can be destroyed via industrialization and kind of pollution. I see this as very much tying together all of those things. This plastic explosives in a Tupperware box in the freezer of this woman who might have just been a student film editor, and might have also been like an actual revolutionary, but all we know at this point is that she really likes sangria and wearing cool fashion glasses.
And muumuus.
Yes, yeah.
Parrot muumuus in particular. Yeah, that's a really great point. Just to kind of round up the start of this phase of the conversation, I'll read the quote about them living in New York. It was a slow pan shot of 24 FPS as constituted on some long ago date the two women were unable now to agree on. In always having drifted in and out, and a patient impatient apprentices, old movie freaks, infiltrators, and provocateurs of more than one political stripe. But there was a core that never changed, and in it included genius film editors Ditsa and Zippy Pisk, who'd grown up in New York City and, except for geographically, never left it. California's only reality for them was a million ways it failed to be New York. Magnons? Zippy would smile grimly. Okay, for a shopping center. Somewhere on Long Island, perhaps. Very nice ladies' toilet, of course, but please, this is no major store. Ditso was the food fetch. Try and get a Danish anywhere out here. They found West Coast people cold and distant, as invariably as they remembered apartment living in the Big Apple being all warm and neighborly. I love that. And I especially love the way that it's used in direct contrast in the next paragraph to what it's like living in Los Angeles. I wanted to get your guys' opinion on the inclusion of what happens to Ditsa on the beach as a illustration of Los Angeles. Do we think this is just included here for humor purposes? There's obviously a case to be made that Pynchon is making fun of an actual, sexual assault or even rape that's occurring. I was very, I don't want to necessarily say off-put, but interested in what your thoughts were on this inclusion in this character description.
So, would you mind pointing to it specifically? Because I think I know what you're talking about, but I just want to make sure I'm not mistaking it for something else.
Page 196, further down that page from what I just read. Let's see here.
Okay,
I
all
can
right.
read it. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead.
And we certainly do not come up out of the water, fuck somebody right there on the beach, then go jogging away without even leaving their phone number, which had in fact happened to her during the girls' first or introductory weekend on the West Coast.
Well, I guess I see it as I don't know if I read it as sexual assault. It could definitely be, but I see it more as a kind of a commentary on like kind of an inversion of the mermaid myth that surfers have become in American culture.
Mm.
I see it as mostly a riff on that, and it might be implying assault, but I think that the offense is more in the lack of like emotional care than to the actual act. That's the way I read it, at least.
Yeah, I think that's the way that it was intended. I couldn't help but walk away from that paragraph after, sort of the initial laughter of the absurdism of it, if it's referring to a, non-intimacy connection in sex, as like, well, but what he's literally describing happen is sort of an assault. Luke, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few things to say about it. I didn't necessarily. It strikes me as the type of thing that somebody kind of bullshitting with their friends would be like, "Oh yeah, I fucked this surfer on the beach, and he never gave me his phone number. I never saw him again." Um, like the type of thing that there's more to that story than is being told.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's just kind of being squashed down into a little soundbite just for other people's entertainment. I don't want to discount the possible sexual assault aspects of it, because that could be in there. Even it does strike. I mean, the guy in this scenario would have been at least disingenuous about his intentions, presumably. Um, I don't know if it would be outright, like violent sexual assault, but more like coercive, perhaps. That being said, yeah, like I said, it strikes me as this is another kind of detail that I could see somebody saying out loud, then pitch and hearing it, and later including it in a book where, like I said,
Mm-hmm.
the person's just kind of trying to tell a story to keep people's attention. And it's not a bad story in terms of, like it would, if you're singing in a group of women, and they started telling the story, it would get your attention. It probably would stick with you. Um, and it also, I, it also kind of perhaps speaks to, like I think in chapter 11, I want to say it's the overuse of the word love is mentioned.
Yeah,
That comes up in Inherent Vice a lot.
it does. Almost that same quote.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, so it could also speak to Pynchon's kind of frustration or um misgivings about the hippie movement, and it's, you know, like the free love aspect of it, how kind of empty and it was, how kind of empty it was, and how men probably took advantage of that attitude in women to fake emotional connections and just use them physically, if that makes sense.
I could also see a reading in which you take as a given that it was what we would now consider a form of sexual assault, the kind of coercive style that you were talking about, Luke. I think you can take that as a given and also view it as Zippy not framing it that way to herself as kind of a part of the subculture of the hippie movement coping
Hmm.
with that kind of the abuses inherent to what free love really was. Where even if she doesn't think of it as assault, she still is hurt by this coercive action, and she still feels that pain, and she's framing it this way so that she can package it as a joke. I think all of that is there.
Yeah, I think that that's probably the sort of point that I came to in walking away from it. At the conclusion of my thoughts was something along those lines, because sexual assault, rape was a big part of the reason why the free love movement died, as people started taking advantage of what that meant from a standpoint of, you can just abuse people, and they may not initially see it as anything different from what they were already engaging in, but it comes down to the intent, or the behavioral um machinations of the person engaging in it, I guess. It's just a very interesting inclusion, because it is, by one parts, objectively quite funny in its absurdity, especially the way that it's recounted as like, despite its air of the supernatural, having left both sisters with a certain attitude towards the surfing community, of which, because of his xanthrocoid looks, they had singled out Howie as typical. The humor is certainly there, but it's just that undertone of just like, this kind of makes me feel gross when I really think about it for anything longer than just a glance. So we do get introduced to the rest of the 24 FPS film collective in this section. um I love the fact that they have a unit astrologer who, as soon as they found out both Geminis, started giving them daily horoscopes, and then they became incredibly superstitious immediately afterwards. I enjoy that inclusion. But there is also another connection to Inherent Vice, in that we get a look at Sledge Poteet, who is mentioned in Inherent Vice as being a former friend of Doc Sportello's, who is referenced when Tariq Khalil shows up at his office to ask him to investigate what happened with his Artesia neighborhood, and to go talk to the bikers who are protecting Wolfman. So this is another instance of, we just mentioned, of another connection that are in these two chapters, but this is another substantive connection between this book and Inherent Vice. And what I want to say, like, what, maybe this is the fifth one that we've come up with so far as we've read the book. The connections between these two are numerous.
Yeah, they do seem like companion pieces, definitely, the two novels. Even I know that the people loop Crying About 49 into in with the other two, make them the California trilogy, but I think Vineland and Inherent Vice are a lot more of a piece of a kind of a like a duology than Crying About 49 does have a lot of similarities, but it's not nearly, they're not nearly as pronounced as the similarities between Vineland and Inherent Vice.
Well, there's a big one that we haven't gotten to yet, but it is upcoming. Um, but no, I think you're right. I think you're right, Luke, in that these two books are very much closer to one another than this book and Chronic Flat 49 is. Um, I think if Inherent Vice is kind of about the death of the hippie era, and sort of Doc sorting through the garbage dump that is his memory to figure out who killed that movement, and kind of how countercultural movements get get co-opted and eventually turn into something evil. This book, Vineland, is sort of like the kind of distorted evil future that awaits those movements when they're completely taken apart. And so I think normally I would say we talked about a lot about the experiment, like reading these books chronologically from a standpoint of the years that they cover within the fictional world that Pynchon is creating. But this one almost, like, I can come away better understanding maybe why Pynchon wrote them in the order that he did, from a standpoint of like, oh God, the Reagan years, and then like the tail end of the Nixon years right before it, and how all these things have built into just the exact opposite of what the 60s was supposed to be, and what the 60s was supposed to be the beginning of. How did it get here? And then working back from there to write a story about sort of the true death of that era and of the countercultural aspects of it that mattered, and how that happens through all of the events of that book. Like, I can understand that sort of thought process to composition that Pynchon may have followed when writing these two books. Of course, we'll never know, but it does occur to me that it kind of makes sense that he would be curious to look more into the background of kind of like how it got so fucked up in the first place.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a vaguely shitty, quote unquote, clever way to frame it, of like basically this is a book centered on women in pretty much every way.
Mm-hmm.
It's about how sometimes men affect women, but it is mostly centered on women. And Inherent Vice can be viewed as kind of like, in the interpretation I talked about last episode, this is the Odyssey with Frenesi as Odysseus. Imagining a version of Zoid where he is actually competent enough to try to piece things together. How did he view all of it happening?
Mm-hmm.
I think you can frame Inherent Vice as the masculine counterpart to the understanding that Vineland is about. Where in Inherent Vice, it doesn't work. It doesn't come together. There is no coherent understanding in the end. From Doc's perspective, I guess.
That's got to be in the top 5 smartest things you've said on this show, Will.
Oh, but there are so many competing for that.
Yeah, I've never thought about that before, but that is so true. Inherent Vice is sort of the masculine counterpart to the femininity that is inherent to Vineland. Yeah.
Now let me knock that out of the top 5 by pointing out that he misspelled moviola. It's a problem, Pynchon. Did you even have an editor?
I feel like, what would you really need to edit out of a Pynchon book,
The E. It's Movii.
Movi. Oh, so true. I do also love the inclusion of the fact that they were smoking marijuana dipped DMT. That's another case where I feel like DMT as a popularized understanding that is a psychedelic is something very recent when talking about the kind of common public. Also, I don't know, as someone who's done DMT, I don't know how you'd be driving if you were managing to inhale DMT, laced with cannabis or not. That is a closed eye, open eye hallucination that you're gonna be sending yourself down.
Well, there is a sub-threshold dose of DMT that is mostly just like really intense wavy.
Mm.
And I think if you're gonna get that kind of dose of DMT that's gonna last more than 5 minutes, smoking like a bunch of joints that are just vaguely full of DMT might get you there.
Could be. That's a good point. I've never had DMT laced into anything.
But it's almost more of a joke about PCP laced joints.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. But like, these are for hippies, man. PCP ain't for hippies. One of the other things that made me laugh incredibly hard was the suggestion of Sledge's suggestion for their slogan. A camera is a gun, an image taken is a death performed. Images put together are the substructure of an after judgment. We will be architects of a just hell for the fascist pig death to everything that oinks. Which for many was going too far. That pun, man, I don't always get hit by puns, but that pun in particular of writing out the longest frickin' slogan that's got like 8 actual slogans in it and then ending that with, which for some of them was taking it too far. That one really got me in these 2 chapters.
I also like that the character tries to defend pigs, the animal, which is a very
Yeah.
Pynchon thing to do. I don't know if we've really been over Pynchon's obsession with or supposed and almost certainly true obsession with pigs, but yeah, that was it's a very Pynchon thing to try to defend pigs. Again, the animal, not cops.
Mm-hmm. Do we have anything to this early introduction to these characters in this organization before Brock Von's sort of, I guess, entrance into the narrative? He's been present, but only in flashbacks. But this is the most access we get to him so far.
I did like the whole Signism thing. It's
Yeah.
worse than racism. It's worse than
Yeah.
sexism, which is such a hippie, such a you know, I don't. I'm searching for the word, but such a very like hippie thing to think that that would be somehow worse than the others that are mentioned, especially in the '60s, when you would think that sexism would be a lot more pronounced and racism would be a lot more pronounced. Um, Although maybe that's not entirely true, considering how enduring both those things are. But I find that pretty funny.
Well, especially reading it in 2023, and I suppose now 2024, where like astrology has had an insane resurgence in popularity, especially amongst like Gen Z and younger millennials, that I would have never expected. Those mentions come across extra funny now between the like Gemini comment that I had already referenced to, but just the way that whole conversation unfolds. Like, what's your sign, Virgo? It figures. And then the signism conversation, like, just that exact exchange back and forth. I feel like I've heard at work with my employees. I want to say like 200 times. So it is especially impactful now. And I know like in the 90s there was another explosion of kind of alternative spirituality, and I'm sure astrology was definitely a part of that. I can't really say that it would have been something I would have been paying attention to at that point in my life, but it is interesting how these things are culturally cyclical. I can't say the word.
Cyclical.
Yeah, cyclical. Thank you.
So I have a galaxy brain interpretation of the inclusion of that.
Ooh.
It's not just a joke about how hippies got frivolous. It's a joke about how when you read it, you have to confront yourself and wonder, is it in any way worse than racism or sexism? Because
sure.
Is racism and sexism bad because of how stupid it is, or is it because of the people it kills and torments? Because both of them are, I think, ways that people frame the badness of bigotry.
Mm-hmm.
And they are two very divergent ideas. And I think that joke kind of gets at that divergence.
That's true. I mean, I definitely had a moment where I was like, what if I take this seriously? Would that be worse if the implications were the same from the standpoint of like your behavior towards people with whatever sign you were signist towards? Would that be worse because you are, being discriminatory towards a larger swath of the population and thus multiple like income levels or skin colors or, regions of geographical origin? Or is it worse to judge, a smaller group of people based upon the color of their skin or anything like that? There's room to make galaxy brain interpretations there. Absolutely.
But I do think mostly the joke is to make you think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it works. It's hilarious. These chapters are great. Which does bring us to the kind of beginning of the end, so to speak, for Frenesi. in that she first sees Brock Vaughn's crossing the courtyard at a college they've gone to, and just sort of in a way that she didn't understand at the time, just her lens lingers on him, and he notices and puts together who she might be and goes over to talk to her. Does someone want to read the description of what he looks like? I'd say this is really the solid picture that Pynchon has given us in our mind.
Sure, I can. The one that starts with Brock was more photogenic?
Yeah.
Yeah. Brock was more photogenic than cute, with his buffed high forehead, modish octagonal eyeglass frames, Bobby Kennedy haircut, softly outdoor skin. He hadn't seen much of Frenesi's face. He continues.
Yeah, so what do we think about this section where the two of them kind of properly meet?
Well, I mean, the innuendos are a bit much. They are.
It is a bit
Well
much, you're
done.
right.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's well done and it's believable and everything, but it's just a little much. I mean, it does make sense that it's not like Brock would be the type to be incredibly subtle. Um, you would think. I mean, you would think that Frenesi. I mean, obviously she has the fetish for guys in uniform. That being said, I mean, you would think that she would initially at least be a little bit more wary or um, not as open to flirting with him right off the bat. Um, but you know, I mean, that's just kind of that's maybe just kind of a personal preference for me. I mean, I would kind of like it better if he kind of wore her down and stuff instead of her just kind of initially being like like clearly attracted to him. Um, but I mean, she's not really portrayed as being super likable anyway, so it does make sense. But yeah, I did. I mean, I was kind of confused by the sequence of events in terms of how we kind of went from, or maybe I'm jumping ahead. Let me look. Yeah, I'm jumping ahead. Never mind. So
Okay.
I thought that Brock was I thought she was sharing footage with Brock already, but I think that that's in chapter 11.
Yeah, this tail end of chapter 10 just kind of introduces their relationship.
Yeah, I think we can infer that she is sharing the film with him because of the way it talks about it in chapter 11, but it isn't made clear yet. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, you're talking about like what deepens their connection, like when Frenesi starts actually bringing him like film reels.
Yeah, for some reason I thought that was already happening in chapter 10, but yeah, it doesn't
Oh
clearly
yeah,
occur until 11, yeah.
yeah, no, yeah. Will, do you have any thoughts on this part?
Well, I find it interesting because the double entendres are a lot. There's a lot of it, and I think the only way you can forgive it is that both of these characters, the only like affective emotion we really see from them that is not like coerced is just horniness, really. Because Brock is like terrified of not being manly in some way. Like that's kind of all we've gotten so far as his actual like insecurities and what drives him. And Frenesi is, you know, deep. Like we've seen her in the flash forward be very freaked out about some very material issues. But in terms of like actual genuine expressions of humanity, all we've really seen from either of them is, I would like to have sexual satisfaction, please, and thank you. And that's a very specific choice that Pynchon has done, and that this kind of brings to a head.
Yeah, true. I think that changes, at least from Nessie's perspective, by the end of chapter 11. Like we do see different emotions, but it is very clear that at this point, yeah, they just want to sleep with one another. I think it's a very I don't know if I'd say realistic depiction of flirting in the sense that it is like the double entendre is real graphic. But it is a realistic style of flirting, certainly between two people. Um, Albeit I think, cranked up to 11. There is just sort of, because of how much backstory we've received before this has even happened, there is a good sense of just impending doom. If you read this section, you're like, no, no, Frenesi, like, don't record him, don't don't talk to him. Like, it just keeps like getting worse and worse the longer these last 2 pages or so before the transition to light happens.
Mhm.
We're just constantly, as the conversation moved forward, I was like, is there any way to get off this ride? Like, is there any way for there to be an off ramp? And of course there's not, because you have that dramatic irony of knowing what the characters don't know at that point. And it's another case of, I think, Vineland being more significantly well written from a standpoint of its construction and character details than the previous books, and that I can't think of any other book in his canon up to this point from publication history that deals so heavily in this dramatic irony of we're building towards a car accident, but the characters can't hear the reader, yelling at them to stop. That kind of sense of impending doom that you get from these sections. It's pretty impressive from a standpoint of his other works up to now.
See, I take issue with that, but only
Yeah.
because of my very specific reading of both Lot 49 and Gravity's Rainbow, wherein I do truly feel like my brain is coming apart in the climaxes of both of those books. And I do think that for me, it is more affective than it seems to be for most people. It does seem, I do read it as a character-driven thing. But I allow that I'm probably reading it in a very odd way.
A specific to you way.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from, though.
Yeah.
It is not immersing the reader in the mindset of the character, or at least it's not trying to do that so much as it is trying to like let you see it.
Yeah, I definitely see it from a plot perspective. Like, I definitely, reading through Oedipus' journey in Lot 49, like, there is part of me that just wants to be like, just stop. Like, there's no profit for you here. But it feels, I guess that feels less intimate or less personal than what's going on in Vineland.
I would like to jump back just a bit to Prairie's introduction to Brockvond.
Yeah.
And in particular, the choice of Ditsa to say, basically, this is on film, so I can't keep it shown.
Paused. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, is this a matter of old celluloid being dangerous to leave on light? Or is this Ditsa just not wanting to do it?
I interpret it as she had old celluloid film stock that if she left it paused, like the frame would burn. That was how I interpreted it. But I think, there is a possibility, or certainly the room for the interpretation you're positing is there. That's for sure.
Yeah, it just strikes me as curious that the idea the next suggestion wouldn't be, okay, hold this up to this light box, which she almost certainly has, and look at it with a
Right,
magnifying glass, like she almost almost certainly has.
Yeah, there's a way for you to just look at this frame. Yeah. No, that's a good call out for sure. Anything else on Brockvon before I ask y'all what your interpretation of the light conversation was? All right, so what was your interpretation of the light conversation?
This only just now occurred to me, but it does seem to be. I was reading the top of 202, just kind of aimlessly, and it does seem to be because the beginning of that paragraph, or the beginning and the middle of that paragraph, is mostly about light and ceiling light and wanting as much light as possible, and then the end of it kind of gets into seemingly like the kind of stuff that light kind of makes go away, like like monsters in the dark. It goes from a discussion of light to a discussion of dreams and dreams coming alive and the power of like lightning which does foreshadow some stuff at the end of chapter 11, which we'll get to. Um, I find it really interesting. I don't necessarily know if I have an interpretation. I just think it's interesting that those two things are kind of juxtaposed and contrasted, light and the things that kind of hide from light, the things that light obscures from the mind.
Well, especially moving from, someone who's about to kind of ruin Frenesi's life, so to speak, and the monstrous aspects of Brock Von that we've come to see. Like, it seems like the transition from a standpoint of the old story is that they're watching that video she took of Brock Von, and then she immediately starts talking about how they're going to be okay if they have enough light. Like, if I just get enough light on this situation, this guy, then maybe the monster that he is, you know, will die away. Or maybe if he doesn't run from the light, he isn't that person that's inside of him. The alternate person he could have been is really there, and I can rescue him. That's real food for thought, Luke.
It ties back into what we were talking about earlier with the Zippy's Zippy's encounter on the beach, and as a whole, that paragraph reminds me a lot of the Byron the Bulb section of Gravity's Rainbow, and it seems a lot about the ways that people allow themselves to indulge in these beliefs that allow them to celebrate the structures in which they live while thinking that they are subverting it.
Yeah, that's another great point. I don't think I have anything to add beyond what y'all have said. So that does bring us to chapter 11, and we get a very entertaining knowledge of surf and why it exists. The concept of this sort of technical college that is created by the ultra rich more to train the people who are going to be their servants and employees is it's tragically funny, but also I feel like not that far-fetched. It's an absurdist interpretation, definitely, but places like that definitely do exist in the world, albeit not from such a rigidly institutionalized perspective. I loved reading through that kind of history and the fact that it's this sort of obsessed with Richard Nixon, like comically buttoned up sort of charm school environment, to the point where it's scandalous that some of the women are rolling up their skirts to their knees. It's like this whole beginning part of this chapter, I guess, is what I'm getting at is like a sketch out of Monty Python. The one person starts smoking weed and it turns into this pandemonium. It is, again, one of the funniest sections of any of the chapters we've read by Thomas Pynchon so far for this show.
Yeah, I love the way that this weed has been assumed to be this Vietnamese import that's incredibly potent, when there's actually no, like, the narrator, in the way that Pynchon often does, the narrator doesn't say either way what's actually in these marijuana cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it very well might be just a bunch of like crappy dirt ditchweed that these surfers are carrying around, and it's just normal people smoking joints in public. But because of the way that the police view it as certainly like this interference from a foreign communist government, it inspires like an actual revolution. I think it's hilarious. It's on a conceptual level very funny, and on the very low level, it's like I'm gonna read. I don't have the page number. Apologies, anybody. But the fateful joint that day could have come, heaven knew, from any of the troop of surfer undesirables who'd lately been finding their way up the cliffside and in among the wholesome collegians, bringing with them their stashes, consisting, up till now, mainly of stems and seeds, which, because of a mysterious anomaly in surfer brain chemistry, actually got them loaded, but which produced in those they were trying to turn on only headaches, upper respiratory distress, shortness of temper, and depression, a syndrome that till now the college kids, not wishing to seem impolite, had pretended to find euphoric.
I laughed really hard at that part too. Yeah.
It's really good. And if anybody who's listening to this has been somehow isolated from like stoner culture,
Mm-hmm.
there's a zone of there's like a group of people who are always on the fringes of stoner culture who do view weed that way. They do view it as something that just gives you a headache, makes you laugh at funny stuff maybe, but mostly just kind of sucks and everyone's just like tricking themselves into it. So it's on many levels very funny, and also just on like this grander scale of very apt criticism of a lot of policing methods.
Oh yeah, totally. And maybe with the, widely accessible nature of dispensaries nowadays, this joke is not going to make sense anymore. But I remember, the first weed that I smoked was definitely pretty terrible. And certainly the people that were smoking the same weed around that time, both with and without me, thought that it was just great because that was what you were sort of supposed to think after indulging in it. That is, that experience I don't think is ever going to be had by someone who grows up in a state where it's legal. There's no reason to not buy it from the dispensary, really.
Hey, now you can save 20%.
I suppose that's true. But no, I think you've hit the nail on the head, certainly. I do also just the description of the freaking Nixon monument is so funny.
It's like Ozymandias or something.
Yeah, exactly. Eating bologna and white bread sandwiches, listening to Mike Curb congregation records on the radio, talking about sports and hobbies and classes and how work was going on. The new Nixon monument, 100-foot colossus in black and white marble at the edge of the cliff, gazing not out to sea but inland, towering above the campus architecture and above the highest treetops, dark and pale, a quizzical look on its face. It's just that's so insane. Ozymandias is such a perfect analog to draw to that. I just can't imagine attending college on a campus that just is being constantly overlooked by 100-foot black and white marble statue of Nixon. That'd just be terrifying.
Well, and the quizzical look on its face does bring to mind the "what?" quote.
Yeah, exactly. Which might be my favorite celebrity quote of all time. I didn't know that quote was in Gravity's Rainbow the first time I read it, and I remember when I flipped to part 3, I think I didn't stop laughing for 25 minutes, and like my friend that I was hanging out with at the time needed to like check if I was gonna be okay.
Yeah, I'd get a shirt with that on.
Obliterature. Come on. He definitely said what at some point. There's no copyright infringement.
Yep, there's no defamation.
This is where Weed Atman enters into the plot line as a professor at this University of the Waves. And I feel like I'm missing something with the weird tall jokes. Like, I get the joke that Weed Admin is like just sort of a nerd who can't stop running like calculations in his head because he's sort of obsessed with the math that he's working on. Like his introduction where they mention that he's tall and then it describes his thought process was another laugh out loud for me when it said Weed saw that he was the tallest person in his vicinity. If vicinity be defined as a domain bounded by a set of points partway to the next person to a height equal to or greater than his own, 6'3.5", this distance varying linearly with the height, his thoughts were interrupted by a scuffle nearby. Like, that description of sort of the way that his mind works and how just sort of weirdly math obsessed it is. All of that is really funny and makes sense to me. The jokes about his height and then the jokes that like that same group of people want to follow him for protection just because he's taller. I feel like I missed something in all of that where it's like it's almost like they're behaving as though the other students he's around are like munchkins in Munchkin Land. and somehow are just unable to see anything and are assuming that there's safe shelter to be found with someone who just happens to be taller than they are. Like, am I missing something in all of that? What did you guys think of that portion of this?
The shortest summation of how I interpret it is as a very cynical version of the life of Brian in a single character. Where
Okay.
it's just a parody of the idea of people looking at someone they perceive to be a prophet and taking their abdications of any kind of actual perspective as proof of it. And the only evidence they have of his like higher order thinking is literally him being taller. I think it's just that. That's how I read it.
that's something that I hadn't thought of. Luke, do you have any ideas?
Not really. Yeah.
Yeah, I do love the description that when he does get shaken from his math reverie and starts looking around, he's just sort of randomly describing in like one or two words the things that he's seeing or what is unfolding. But there is a really interesting sort of poetic description here where it says, "What the hell?" said Weed Admin as a throb of fear went right up his asshole. It was a moment of light in which the true nature of police was being revealed to him. They're breaking people's heads? Like that, the way Pynchon describes that aha moment for somebody, especially with something as, socially relevant now as the police, but that was certainly relevant in the 60s and 70s, and even in the 90s. Like, it's such a short but impactful moment that I feel like a lot of people, especially who are coming to this writing recently, can probably relate to having the past couple of years. It was just very cool to see that represented on the page.
Yeah, it's to me, it's kind of like an inversion of the Franz Pölkler from Gravity's Rainbow. Where in that one you have this, for the people who haven't read Gravity's Rainbow, you have a very dedicated engineer who gets co-opted by the Nazi movement into creating weapons. And here you have just a guy who is obsessed with mathematics. That's all he thinks about. And when
Literally.
he finally opens his eyes, he's like, oh my god, look, there's just random crowd violence going on. This is horrible. Someone should do something. And everyone assumes that means that he knows something. We have this kind of an inversion of the character ending up on the top of the pack instead of the bottom, as it happens in Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah, I'm beginning to pick up more and more your sort of life of Brian, but significantly condensed point, with the way that he gets elevated to the position of like the leader of the People's Republic of Rock and Roll.
And all he wants to do is just like dance and smile.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess also sleep with women. He seems to be fine with that as well.
On the other hand, he's a math professor. Maybe it's less of a desire and more of an openness.
Oh, sure. Yeah. This is his first chance that he's ever had at being famous. And I love the description of his outfit after he becomes famous. Those insane bell bottoms that he starts wearing. And like I think he describes like peace beads and like it's just such a hippie-ish outfit that is so clearly not what he would have been wearing when he was initially introduced in this chapter. So it's so good. There's so much subtle humor in these chapters. Much
subtle humor, like hippies cutting their hair off and gluing it to their faces.
Right, yeah, to speed up the process of becoming hippie, because they just took their first hit of a joint, 35 minutes ago, whatever point in the story. And I think there's an interesting element kind of pushing a little bit further into the narrative of social commentary on how the hippie movement was eventually revealed to be kind of poorly run, poorly conceived, and led to a lot more damage than it is good. That we learn that the kind of creation of the People's Republic of Rock and Roll came out of this one dude's obsession with what he was stylizing as the lost tribe of what were they described as? The
Bolshevik Leninists
yeah.
of Vietnam.
Yeah, just that he had this obsession with this one group of political people that were in Vietnam. Their political machinations didn't work out. They disappeared. And he is hoping that when they get effectively reincarnated politically in another space, that he will somehow be a part of it. And that's why he pushes, for this long, in-depth conversation that, in theory, radicalizes Weed into becoming the leader of this hippie commune or hippie paradise. Like that is also very clever commentary as well that I come away from with chapter 11 in particular, and how, speaking from a real, like, it's just right there on the page, doesn't really take a whole lot of thought, that the leader of a cultural revolution of hippies is led by people hastily assembling their look into the movement, and is led by someone literally named after the most common slang term for a drug. Like, and they're really just following the free usage of drugs rather than any sort of element of political earnestness, which is further amplified by the fact that as this character is giving this manifesto, Weed doesn't seem particularly engaged. Like, he doesn't have anything to say in response to it. There's just a lot of very clever writing that Pynchon has in this section. Do we have anything that we want to talk about with Weed Atman before it transitions to Frenesi and Brock again?
I did like the whole the one part about the kids waiting for them to say asshole, waiting for them to call Weed an asshole.
Do you want to read out that quote, Luke?
Yeah, let me find it.
It is a good one.
So yeah, Jinx, who is Weed's ex-wife, I believe. Frenesi, you're talking about their relationships with Weed, and then Jinx says, I think it's Jinx who says, "Just don't tell me you're in love, okay?" And then Frenesi says, "Sister, I ain't even in line." The kids were giggling in the back. "Funny, huh?" Giggles. "We're just waiting," said Mo. "What for?" "For one of you to say asshole," said Penny. It's just pretty funny. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many individually funny moments, like when Pynchon briefly zooms out of the narrative just before that to talk about how Weed Atman's COINTEL profile, when they would try to eventually move it about, they had to hang a wide load sign on the back of it because of how much it became. There's so many just sort of one-off lines or pieces of dialogue like that statement from Penny that just made me laugh out loud as I was reading through this book. And I think the other really sort of devastating aspect of the quote you just read out, which provides sort of a nice segue for us, is that ultimately who's being referred to by Jinx here is the fact that Frenesi has been seeing Brock, and that Jinx is worried that despite the political affiliations there, that this is something that's just completely physical, that there's no love between them, because she's literally shuttling Frenesi out to the airport, where she flies out to go talk to Brock, as it's revealed about what is going on with 24 frames per second and subsequently the People's Republic of Rock and Roll. As betrayal has become clear to the reader, but first betrayal chronologically, so to speak, has become clear to the reader, that she's been bringing the film canisters out to Brock, and Brock's looking at it. She's providing him with information about, the places they've been and what they're doing. And now they have this additional sort of insight into the People's Republic of Rock and Roll and Weed Atman because of the fact that Frenesi is feeding all this information to Brock and subsequently the FBI, which is just, it's such a heartbreaking thing to read, because it's so clear that, especially coming right after that statement of, yeah, she's not in love, she's not even in line, is just sort of she's just compensating for the way that she actually feels, and is trying to almost gaslight herself into believing that it's something less than it actually is, while also tricking the people around her. It's just, it's very sad.
Yeah, the next real like extensive narrative we get on the subject is she felt electrically excited more than his cock just then. She needed his embrace.
That beginning of
Yeah, I mean, it's just, she has a real emotional sense of attachment to him. It's far more than just the uniform fetish at this point.
yeah, completely. Which we'll get to more of when we cover the end of the chapter. Is there anything else that anyone has? Well, I guess that kind of does start to bring us to the end of the chapter as far as it kind of plays out their evening together. That quote. I guess we should briefly talk about the whole sort of I guess homophobia that is represented here, not specifically from the standpoint of whether or not it is homophobic, but what Brock is getting to in wanting Weed's soul and the connection between him and Weed as a result of both of them sleeping with Frenesi. What did we think about this section of the chapter, this conversation?
So I've got no clue about him wanting the soul, but I do actually read that as like very much a very homoerotic scene, like as like a consciously homoerotic one in Brock.
Sure.
Like I don't see how you read that as anything but like a someone who's in the closet, whether they're homosexual or bisexual or whatever, just kind of packaging together this fantasy that he has.
Mm-hmm.
But I cannot connect it to the spirit thing. That's the part of this chapter that I do not understand at all.
The theory that I came away with from a standpoint of the spiritual aspect, and there is absolutely subtext to be read into this being an earnest expression of homosexual desire. I don't discount that at all. But the reasoning for the spirit comment that I come across is I think there is something within not Weed Atman, but Brock Vond rather, that wants to be a countercultural figure, wants to be a hippie, wants to be a part of that movement. It doesn't seem to necessarily be just a uniform fetish thing like with Frenesi and police officers is primarily where we've seen that, or agents have seen that crop up, but rather with Brock, when they're talking about how they can best sort of honeypot him from the mob hit perspective of that chapter, it is all about, like, it does eventually become Frenesi specifically, but it is all about like what he is attracted to is, this expression of counterculture through movement, through clothing, through how women looked, through the sexuality present in that. But I think the fact that he wants the soul of a man, that it isn't just like an expression of a homoerotic desire, but rather an expression of he wishes he had a person who could exist in the movement, and the soul of a man who could exist in that movement, but he doesn't inherently have that, doesn't know how to get that, and his only connection to it is through the possibility of sleeping with one of the female members of that movement, and that maybe if there's some conduit between him and a man of that movement, he could become more like the person that would be accepted by them and be present there. And maybe the end goal of that is just to have more free love and more free association with the women as a part of it. But I don't know. There seems to be something in that is potentially pointing towards him having desires outside of law enforcement. I mean, when you look a lot of sort of, I'll use like conservatism, modern conservative culture, for example, a lot of the top commentators in that world used to be part of the Hollywood world or tried to break into it. There was an initial earnestness to be a part of the thing that they then talk about hating, but they get busted down to when they're older and have no other choice than to become, conservative political commentary. So it's something that exists within a lot of places. People who become cops, that wasn't often the first thing they wanted to do. Potentially they were very different and they ended up becoming a cop because they couldn't make a lifestyle out of any other way of being. So that's sort of what I pull out of that yearning for for the soul of weed admin, but I certainly would be open to any other interpretations people may have.
I think that's a good interpretation. I mean, I think there could be an aspect of, I don't know. I mean, he does seem to be obsessed with the fact that Frenesi is sleeping with the both of them, and I don't really know how to put this, but I mean, um, I mean, maybe there's an aspect of like him wanting to like prove his sexual prowess by conquering weed and being like the triumphant lover of the two of them, the one that wins her heart, or the one that she likes better, the one that she ends up choosing between the two of them. And part of that would be possessing his soul. Maybe thereby he would possess his weed soul or something like that. I mean, it is a bit of a trope in literature for the whole like two guys competing for one woman thing. I mean, I'm thinking of Gormenghast in particular right now. It's which is a bit of a subplot in the first book of that trilogy. Um, but yeah, I like your interpretation, and then I think there's also probably an aspect of what I was just talking about with kind of a sexual competition, through which he hopes to kind of conquer weed. He might also view weed. He might also view weed as kind of the soul of the counterculture, or like
Hmm.
like the because weed is shown to be kind of the driving force behind the People's Republic of Rock and Roll. Um, so if he possesses the movement's heart, like weed is kind of the heart of the movement. So if he possesses the spirit of that of the move, like weed is kind of the spirit of the movement. So if he possesses weed, then he possesses the spirit of the movement.
He can destroy it.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, which he is shown to want to destroy it. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's also just kind of I think showcasing how evil and how much of a villain he is, and just kind of yet another unlikable aspect of his personality and his character.
Yeah. I mean, no matter what the answer is, he wanting somebody's soul is never a positive thing. Like
Yeah.
this is
Are
the
you saying there's something wrong with marriage?
uh there's really no good way for me to answer that question. You've trapped me in a corner.
Aha!
But no, I think that is an excellent interpretation as well. Just because you're right, weed is the center of that particular movement, which is an outgrowth of the countercultural movement that Brock Von hates as a whole. And if he does possess it, then he can destroy it, or he can take it over for his own means, or whatever that may mean for him. Um, any other thoughts on this section before we go into the end of chapter 11?
So I guess I had a question about the choice of the line. Well, not line, but the choice of the kind of dialogue. You can figure it out, can't you? He cried over the booming death drone outside. You have a smart-ass angle on everything else. Why can't you see this one? Your boyfriend is in the way, in our way. And then it's
Yeah.
described as just quiet enough to register as deferent, sincere. And I struggle to bring that in accord with either of the interpretations that both of you um, went into there.
Well, I mean, bringing up the point that Luke had about it could just be a case where he's wanting to triumph over the fact that both of them are sleeping with her. That would certainly be a line that supports that part of it. Our could also be referring to the FBI rather than him and Frenesi, in the sense
Sure.
that her not giving more information or not killing Weed or disillusioning Weed is getting in the way of the royal hour, we'll say, of the FBI not being able to dismantle the People's Republic of Rock and Roll. So I think there's a couple different ways that one can interpret that term hour.
I guess I struggle with understanding how a person would phrase it that way in this setting and not expect Frenesi to be entirely turned off by the idea, and to use an unfortunate turn of phrase. Just I see that as kind of like in any other setting, that would be like oh my gosh, they revealed themselves kind of sentence. And is it just that Frenesi has spent so much time focusing on her ideals of who Brock really is underneath, as we will get into more, or I don't understand this exchange.
That's entirely fair. I think between this and the final line of the chapter where he laughs at her, I think it's pointing to the fact that like he does not give a shit about how she feels, and certainly reinforces his evil as a character, in the sense that he probably understands, if I was to guess, that she is falling in love with him, certainly does by the end of this chapter, and probably knows that he can just say stuff like that and she will remain with him because, you know, she's a I can fix him girly. So I think that it just speaks to the casual cruelty and the casual evil of the character, that he's willing to just give the game away because he feels secure in the idea that she's not going to leave him, because of the fact that he's built this relationship with her that is meant to ensnare her emotionally.
I guess I just read this all as essentially the equivalent, a very sexualized equivalent of like a villain having James Bond tied up with a laser very slowly moving towards him, and the villain's just vamping on and on and on, but there's no laser and James Bond isn't tied up. So it's just like James Bond standing there getting yelled at for like these things that he already kind of knew and was expecting. And then Frenesi is, in this case, James Bond is, sitting there and just being like, yes, okay, I can save you, Dr. No. Like, and I struggle to understand how that meshes with her character beyond this chapter.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it rung very true to me.
Okay.
Like, and maybe this is potentially like I have been that woman before in relationships with people. Obviously, not with a psychotic FBI agent, but in that someone does make it very clear what red flags they have or what red flags exist in that relationship. And my response was just to be like, okay, and just think that that was fixable. I've also known a lot of other women who have been in the same position. So, this was actually this last chapter, and potentially the reason why it had such an emotional effect on me is it rung very true to experiences that I have had and that I've seen like my friends have. And I was very impressed that Pynchon was able to capture that, because it seems, at least to me anyway, a more significantly female experience than a male experience. Not saying that there isn't some on both sides of that gender equation, but I was very impressed with the realism in which it was rendered. It certainly feels like maybe he talked to several women and somehow pieced together what he wrote here.
I guess from my perspective as someone who's been raised in a post-feminist media landscape,
Mm-hmm.
I read it as almost kind of like going way too far in that direction of being like, isn't this how women always act?
Mm-hmm.
But if you view it as believable, if it meshes with Frenesi's character to you or to anyone else, I'm not saying that it doesn't. I just have trouble seeing it. It seems a little too exaggerated to be even remotely believable, personally. But again,
I think that there also could be some sort of meta commentary on the countercultural movement falling in love with what was destroying them. That Pynchon could be engaging there too. I mean, so like how many hippies were killed by heroin? How many community that were these revolutionary places were destroyed by that drug or any other, or infiltrated by COINTEL processes and all of that. I think that there is another interpretation of it from a meta commentary perspective, even if you don't find it necessarily emotionally, that Pynchon is talking about that self-destructive streak, or that nature of which a lot of these countercultural figures ended up emotionally or otherwise falling in love with someone was destroying them from the inside out.
I think that's a really good way to put it. I do. It is entirely with the character side of this section that I struggle to understand. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Luke, did you have any thoughts on this portion? I guess we're just sort of like fully into it.
No, I've just been enjoying hearing y'all talk. Yeah.
Yeah, I found, like I had said at the beginning of the episode, I found this last section where kind of Frenesi and Brock are navigating the beginning of this relationship, and that Frenesi is sort of incapable of keeping things casual, so to speak, with him at this point. Like, and the way that Pynchon writes this section out, my God, from a standpoint of the way that it builds and the way that it increases in intensity until you hit the end of the chapter, and how it just starts with this small comment that Frenesi couldn't help but like desire to have her arms around him, or to have his arms around her. And that is such a clear indication of where her mental state is at, and it telegraphs so clearly to the reader that even though she's just said that it's not love, it is building towards that in a way that she is going to be incapable of keeping from happening. And then eventually, just again, like the additional artistic rendering of the fact that this is happening during like a horrible storm, and how that is obviously like an omen for what is going to happen if she follows down this pathway, that adds additional artistic layer to it. And as Frenesi kind of fully explains her thought process out to the reader, that just she feels as though there is an alternative version of him that exists, that is still in him, that she can somehow pull out. As I had just said not too long ago, I find that to be a very common experience with a lot of women, for right or for wrong. And it's communicated in a way that surprised me from a male author, but also just when you reach that fever pitch of like, she finally sort of makes this declaration after she's opened the motel room to the storm outside. Like, it's just such a beautifully written section in its devastation and in its emotional sort of articulation of what's going on. And then it ends after she's gone to sleep, and she wakes up and kind of has that final sort of illustration of love. I think that one of the ways in which like a very serious couple can communicate how serious they are about each other is to use a phrase like, I like watching you sleep, and have it not come across creepy. I think that's an example of when a relationship is at a very serious point, when there's real love being built there. And that Frenesi is doing that, and is hoping that there is going to be some degree of reciprocation or earnestness from the other side. And that instead she realizes that his eyes are open, and he's been watching her the entire time, and his response is to laugh at her for falling in love with him. Like, I wept after I finished this chapter. It is some of the most impressive writing that Pynchon has done that we have covered yet on this podcast. It is some of the most impressive characterization and work that he's done in putting the reader into the mind of one of his characters. And it is one of the most emotionally impactful things that has happened in this book or any other that we've covered so far. It's amazing.
That's a really good way to put it. And I just want to make it clear, because I kind of clarified it earlier off mic. But basically, like, I agree entirely. I just find that the believability with regard to some specific things Brock says kind of torpedoes the suspension of disbelief for me, which is not normally an issue, but because this section is so emotionally resonant, it puts a black mark on it personally. But yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to put the incredible characterization that happens from there to the end of the chapter, and in that paragraph that I read from immediately preceding. It is beautiful, and it is incredibly intense, and emotional. It's just I do find those lines of dialogue a little jarring.
Yeah, fair. I was starting to tear up again just recounting it. Yeah, man, it's so rare for any author to reach that height. And it's moments like this where, like, again, we've mentioned it in several episodes, but the people who call this book Pinch on Light, Harold Bloom saying there was nothing redeemable, not a sentence in this book, like, how do you read this chapter? You could read this chapter divorced from the context of the rest of the book and still find something resonant in it. Um, it just blows my mind that this book continues to be so underexplored or underlooked.
Yeah, I guess that brings us to the very end of the scene, which is truly just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to read the last paragraph of this chapter. At some point, he must have gone drifting off to sleep, and she hadn't noticed. She watched over him, hers for a while, allowing herself to shudder with, even surrender to, her need for his bodily presence, his beauty, the fear at the base of her spine, the prurient ache in her hands. At last, so swept and helpless, she leaned in to whisper to him, her heart's overflow, and saw in the half-light what she'd thought her closed eyelids had been open all the time. He'd been watching her. She let out a short, jolted scream. Brock started laughing.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, up until that point, for the weirdos who are listening to this and haven't read the chapter, you know, it's just her internal thought process, how much she thinks about this man, how much she feels about this man, and to
yeah.
have all of that pull together in this big swell of her whispering like sweet everythings into his sleeping ear, and nope, he's been watching her this whole time, is just, it is horrifying in a just deeply depressing way for me.
Yeah. I hate him so much. Yeah, I hate Brock Fond, unlike I've hated, I think, any Pinch on antagonist. So evil.
Yeah, I mean, all of the vamping, as I so uncharitably characterized it earlier. I mean, it is just him demonstrating exactly how aware of himself he is, exactly how
Yeah.
aware of the value he is fighting against.
Yep. He's laboring under no delusions of the kind of man that he is. He knows um God. Yeah. It's rare that a piece of writing affects me this heavily emotionally, but Pinchon is able to do it here, and it's incredible. Do we have
I'm
Yeah,
gonna
go
be
ahead,
honest
Luke.
here at the end. I mean, I do get why it's sad and stuff, but I do think I think you could view it as comedic, the fact that she's like pouring her heart out to him as if he's asleep, and then he ends up just sitting there staring at her. Um, I get that it's like villainous for Brock and it's sad, but I do think that you could play that kind of situation for comedy and like a sitcom and stuff. There's a level of absurdity to it. I think that I don't know. I don't want to push back too much, but it's just I found it to be like somewhat, at least somewhat comedic in terms of like it's super serious. You know, the paragraphs leading up to it are very sad and serious, and then he's pouring her heart out, and he's just sitting there staring at her, um, pretending to be asleep, but he's not. I found it. I found that you could interpret it as being comedic.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a way that you could frame it that way. Um,
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
I don't think I come away with it away from it thinking that that was what Pinchon was doing.
No, I don't know. I do think it's meant to be absurd, but not necessarily comedic, maybe.
it reminds me a lot of that second chapter of The Crying of Lot 49, which if
Yeah, fair.
anyone
Yeah.
didn't listen to that discussion, it's kind of like an amalgamation of three different perspectives: one of sheer abstract comedy, one of like deep terrifying like control, and one of like whimsy and personal liberty. I think that there's a lot of that going on here too. I think that both we've only established 2 readings, both of those readings, and probably more, are entirely valid. Like I don't think that reading this and finding it mostly comical means that you're ignoring the emotional intensity, because it's one of those things that you just kind of have to, like, you got to force yourself to view it in a different way than your first impression, I guess. Like a lot of his stuff, it's not like you're missing anything. It's just a choice to view it differently.
Yeah, very, very well said. That does bring us to the end of chapter 11. Did anyone have anything else they wanted to mention before we went into parts?
This is just a little small note for our listeners. Originally the PR3 thing confused me. Um, upon thinking about it for longer than 2 seconds, it's that's just an abbreviation of the People's Republic of Rock and Roll. I don't know if anyone else was confused by that, because I was initially
Yeah.
confused, and then I puzzled it out, and it seems very obvious in retrospect. But
It's a great joke acronym.
yeah. I just thought I'd point that out just in case anyone was. I thought it was like maybe like a different, like another like 24 FPS, but like a different subversive group or different stuff. I was confused for a while, so I just thought I'd point that out in case anyone else was struggling.
Mm-hmm. Good call out.
Yeah, in general, anybody who's listening to this, hope it's understood. We've all sat here and bashed our heads into these books over and over again. None of these thoughts are things that sprout effortlessly from reading these books. These are all things that everything all of us have said has come from stupid amounts of thinking about books that could also just be viewed as very silly.
This is very true. Could not have said that better myself. Any funny parts of the chapter that anyone wants to bring up that we didn't cover?
So we did cover it, but I did find it quite hilarious to picture dudes in the 60s cutting off their hair and taping it on their face. I've had a beard more or less consistently for like 5, 6, 7 years, maybe even as many as 8.
Pretty solid beard too at that.
Yeah. I appreciate it. But yeah, I just find it really funny that guys would do that. I'm not saying that anyone actually did that in the 60s, although it wouldn't surprise me. But it's a very funny mental image.
Yeah, I would, as it's more or less been confirmed at this point that Paul Thomas Anderson is making Vineland into, I hope to God that he films that entire sequence where somebody on the quad smokes weed and then the entire school goes insane. I would just, the entire time, just picturing it in my head, I was losing it, and I would love how that whole sequence and then the transformation of them all turning into hippies from these Nixonite sort of factotums. I would just love to see how he would portray that on film, because I think it'd be so funny to see filmed out.
I really find kind of just the whole first half of chapter 11 hilarious nonstop.
Yeah.
So I'll just pick the first paragraph there, just because everything about the way this is phrased is very funny to me. The shape of the brief but legendary Trocero County coast, where the waves were so high you could lie on the beach and watch the sun through them, repeated on its own scale the greater curve between San Diego and Terminal Island, including a military reservation which, like Camp Pendleton in the world at large, extended from the ocean up to a desert hinterland. At one edge of the base, pressed between the fence line and the sea, shimmered the pale archways and columns, the madrone and wind-shaped cypresses of the cliff-top campus of College of the Surf. Against the somber military blankness at the back, here was a lively beachhead of drugs, sex, and rock and roll, the strains of subversive music day and night, accompanied by tambourines and harmonicas, reaching like fog through the fence, up the dry gulches and past the sentinel antennas, the white dishes and masts, the steel equipment sheds, finding the ears of sentries attenuated but ominous, like hostile native sounds and movie about white men fighting savage tribes. It's not like it's not a laugh out loud moment, but I just find it's perfect setup for everything else being hilarious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, even like if you just not to just start reading the book in an audio performance, but even if you just go on to the next paragraph of how it had come to this was a mystery to all levels of command, especially here, bracketed by the two ultra-conservative counties of Orange and San Diego, having like a border town, you're an extreme combination of both, attracting the wealthy who gathered around golf courses and marinas in houses painted the same color as the terrain, with vast floor areas but no more elevation than there had to be. Flew in and out of private airfields, would soon be dropping in on Dick Nixon, just over the county line in San Clemente, without even phoning first. Most of them solid Southern California money, oil, construction pictures. Ostensibly, College of the Surf was to have been their private polytechnic for training the sorts of people who'd work for them, offering courses in law enforcement, business administration, the brand new field of computer science, admitting only students likely to be docile, enforcing a haircut and dress code. Nixon himself confessed to finding a little stodgy. It was the last place anybody expected to see any dissent from official reality. But suddenly, here with no prelude, it had begun. The same dread disease infecting campuses across the land. Too many cases, even in the first days, for campus security to deal with. Like it's so. There's a real comedy ramp to it from the first paragraph that you read, Will, to the second one where it builds, and then finally to the all-out absurdity of what happens. As soon as someone lights up a joint, like it just follows such a neat escalation over the course of the chapter. It's amazing.
Well, it almost reads like what's the word? Brain. Anyway, it reads like a folder entry in like a CIA document on
Yeah.
the stages of Salamification
Yeah.
the USSR is bringing around the world, and they're pointing to like these weed riots as somehow an inherent feature of colleges, that even the sterilized technical institutes that only train people to be police officers and computer programmers, even they are susceptible to communist infiltration.
Mm-hmm. Which was a very real concern from the Nixon era. That was something that there's documents that he wanted the CIA to basically go in there and bust heads to break up any kind of attempts at infiltration by communists, whether the students knew it or not. It's also just based in reality, which is again, truth is stranger than fiction more often than not, and Pynchon makes that very clear in the things that he writes. But I don't think I had any other funny moments to go over. I think we pretty much got most of them as we went along.
Well, to me, it's obvious that it's the on her feet to insist that pigs are really groovy. In fact, far groovier than any people or than any humans their name ever gets applied to. Apologies for my mouth not working, but that defense of pigs is so Pynchon. It just
be my
is.
choice, actually. Yeah.
Ooh.
So,
I would have to say probably the College of the Surf as a concept, because of its blending of sort of real life and Pynchon-esque humor and thematic writing. But I would say in specific the frickin' Ozymandias statue of Nixon really stands out to me as something being particularly Pynchon-esque. Do you have a backup, Luke, or do we want to go to quotes?
I did not have a backup. So yeah.
Alrighty. So that does bring us into quotes. Will, why don't you kick us off here?
All right. This is like many of my choices, just a section that I really love the way it reads. There's more to it, but that's all I'm really bringing it up for. Again, no page number. This is right after the Signism bit. in chapter 10. Maybe a page later. Night in movies whirred on, reel after reel went turning, carrying Prairie back to and through an America of the olden days she'd mostly never seen, except in fast clips on the tube meant to suggest the era, or distantly implied in reruns like Bewitched or The Brady Bunch. Here were the usual miniskirts, wire-rimmed glasses, and love beads, plus hippie boys waving their dicks, somebody's dog on LSD, rock and roll bands doing take after take, some of which was pretty awful. Strikers battled strike breakers, and police by a fence at the edge of a pure green feathery field of artichokes while storm clouds moved in and out of frame. Troopers evicted the members of a commune in Texas, beating the boys with slapjacks, grabbing handcuffed girls by the pussy, smacking little kids around, and killing the stock. All of which Prairie, breathing deliberately, made herself watch. Suns came up over farm fields and bright-shirted pickers with the still outlines of buses and portable toilets on trailers in the distance, shone pitilessly down on mass incineration of American-grown pot. The flames weak, orange distortions of the daylight, and set over college and high school campuses turned into military motor pools, throwing oily shadows. There was little mercy in these images except by accident, backlit sweat on a guardsman's arm as he swung a rifle towards a demonstrator, a close-up of a farm employer's face that said everything in its subject was trying not to. Those occasional meadows and sunsets, not enough to help anybody escape seeing and hearing what the film implied they must.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the best written sections of these two chapters for sure.
All right, so my quote is from 195. They particularly believed in the ability of close-ups to reveal and devastate. When power corrupts, it keeps a log of its progress, written into that most sensitive memory device, the human face. Who could withstand the light? What viewer could believe in the war, the system, the countless lies about American freedom, looking into these mugshots of the bought and sold? Hearing the synchronized voices repeat the same formulas, evasive, affectless, cut off from whatever they had once been by promises of what they would never get to collect on. I especially like the whole calling the human face a memory device.
Mm-hmm.
That's really good.
Yeah, that was one of my contenders for quotes. Go ahead, Will.
I was just going to say the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. Specifically that line that you singled out. When power corrupts, it keeps a log of its progress written in the most sensitive memory device, the human face. Like, wow. One of those moments where you just are in awe of Pynchon's abilities as a writer. Probably unsurprising to anyone after listening to the duration of this episode, my quote comes from the end of chapter 11. Although my previous contender before reading through these chapters again was that same section in chapter 10. So points to Luke for almost stealing, where it says, she understood as clearly as she could allow herself to what Brock wanted her to do. Understood at last, dismally, that she might even do it. Not for him, unhappy fucker, but because she had just lost too much control. Time was rushing all around her. These were rapids, and as far ahead as she could see, it looked like Brock's stretch of the river. Another stage, like sex, children, surgery. Further into adulthood, perilous and real, into the secret that life is soldiering. That soldiering includes death. That those soldiered for, not yet and often never in on the secret, are always, at every age, children. She came and lay next to him, but not touching. The storm held the city down like prey, trying repeatedly to sting it into paralysis. She lay on one elbow, unable to stop gazing at Brock, pretending to herself that it made some difference to him whether or not she and Weed were fucking, just as she had to pretend that Brock was not really what he looked like to everybody else, namely, the worst kind of self-obsessed collegiate dickhead, projected on into adult format, but that someplace lost, stupefied, needing her intercession was the real Brock, the endearing adolescent who would allow her to lead him, stumbling out into light she imagined as sun plus sky with an 85 filter in, returning him to the man he would have grown into. It could have been about the only way she knew to use the word love anymore. Its trivializing in those days already well begun. Its magic fading. The subject of all that rock and roll, the simple resource we want to save us. Yet if there was anything left to believe, she have in the power even of the daylit commodity of the 60s to redeem even Brock. Amiably, stupidly, brutal, fascist Brock. Yeah, I just... no notes. It's just so perfect for all of the reasons that I've already mentioned. And just cuts to the heart of the kind of character that Frenesi is, the kind of, woman that Frenesi is as well. It even when looking back to other sections of the book, even comes out of the whole relationship between her and Zoid, in that Zoid tells her at their wedding, isn't it amazing how love can save anyone? And she doesn't have a response. And now here she is in the exact same position Zoid was in, where she is trying to believe that her love, if given to Brock, is going to save him from being a brutal, fascist. And so she's really no different than Zoid. It's getting harder for her to make a distinction. And it's about, when she actually feels real love, when Zoid, and who those people are. And just the way that it's a climax of that whole thought process of that second half of chapter 11, and the way that it articulates that mentality of I can fix him, I can fix him, I can save him. It's nothing short of amazing.
Yeah, just to continue alienating people who haven't read all of his other books, it's very reminiscent of like this whole chapter 11 can be viewed as a very fleshed out version of maybe one of the most quoted lines in Gravity's Rainbow: an army of lovers can be defeated. Whether it's Zoid, who's just a true blue hippie, he just wants to smoke weed and everyone to get along, or it's Frenesi, who was raised in this culture of, union organization. They're the lovers, and they've been defeated. The only people who are still going are people like DL, who she was never, maybe on a personal level, driven by her emotions, but that's not why she did the things that she did politically. It's an interesting and very somber end of a chapter.
Yeah, that's for sure. Over the past couple of weeks that the show's been off, we have received different comments or sort of correspondence from you guys, our listeners. The first one that we got, Luke, can you read that YouTube comment?
Yeah, so we got a comment from, I think the username is the M as in mother. I was so disappointed that Pinchin and Public Podcast stopped with their group readings because I'm doing my second reading of M&D, and voila, this suddenly sprouts out. So far, I'm liking it, but it's too early to drop judgments. For now, you've earned a subscriber. My only gripe for the time being is that you put the summaries for all the 5 chapters all together at the beginning, whilst it would be nicer if you splitted those. Let's see how this develops anyway. And then a celebratory emoji. We appreciate the fact that you're enjoying our M&D coverage. We enjoyed making those episodes, obviously. M&D was a bit of a struggle looking back on it, just in terms of, I felt like we were like running a marathon or something. It felt almost unending, and for kind of in the middle there. It was definitely, well, I don't want to describe it as a slog because it was enjoyable, but felt like quite an undertaking. Whether or not it seemed like to our listeners that was true or not, I do not know, but it felt like quite an undertaking to tackle that book. So we appreciate it. Thanks for subscribing to our YouTube channel. I believe our YouTube channel is not quite as successful as our podcast is. So we appreciate it. Hope you keep listening. Hope you listen to this episode eventually and hear us talking about your comment. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That was quite an undertaking, and we were at it for, I think like 8 months was how long Mason and Dixon ran for, but
A while, yeah.
yeah, it was quite an experience to go through, especially for our second book, but it was a lot of fun. Thank you for listening to our show. Will, can you read the next thing that we got?
Yeah, and this one was quite a bit later in terms of actual time period. This was only a few days ago now. We got a lovely shout out from Seth over at Waste Mailing List. I'll confess, I was skeptical of a new show trying to fill the hole of our hearts left by the dissolution of Pinchin in Public. However, at Pinchin Pod have done an excellent, absolutely incredible job of continuing in the tradition of serialized chapter analysis. And we just wanted to publicly say thank you, Seth. We appreciate pushing eyes in our direction, and I think all of us have some very high opinions of a lot of the stuff that you have done in public regarding analysis and interpretation of Thomas Pynchon's novels and the work that you've done in kind of acting as a hub for communication. So thank you on all of those levels.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing to get a shout out.
He also wrote, I think he did another tweet that he posted on Instagram at least that says, that is to say, consider this my glowing endorsement, some seriously knowledgeable and incisive minds at work here. Which, I do like to think of myself as knowledgeable and having an incisive mind, but it's always nice for that to be confirmed. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Getting shout outs from members of the Pinchon community that has sort of driven, I mean, our engagement, certainly, given where this podcast originated out of, but also just the Pinchon sort of world of readers as a whole is really awesome. Really good to be seen by those folks in particular. Finally, we also received a shout out from Thomas Pynchon's Ghost. We were mentioned in a tweet from that account where it says, Gravity's Rainbow is the ultimate fiction. You have to be a little crazy and prone to addiction to become obsessed, but for the right person, it's a great outlet and extremely rewarding experience. Unfortunately, the only people that will understand your passion are other weirdos on the same journey. Thank you, social media. Thank you, Thomas Pynchon. And then he continues on to say podcasts such as Corpse in Orbit, Slow Learners Pod, Pynchon in Public, and Pynchon Pod, that is us, will help you on your journey, and Substacks such as Oedipus Kvas. So, again, being mentioned by a member of sort of the online Pynchon community of readers, especially amongst other names like those other shows and those other sort of sources of information, it's a big honor. That being said, next week we will be back with another discussion. We're going to continue going through Vineland until it's done, and then we're going to move on to another book. So after chapters 10 and 11, we are going to be discussing chapter 12 next week. So we thank you guys for listening. As always, we thank you for any and all comments we receive from you guys. Please feel free to keep sending in any questions or comments that you have on Vineland.
Subscribe, click the bell on YouTube.
Oh, yeah. You got it. Absolutely.
Smash that like button.
Smash the like button.
Leave us eight 5-star reviews a piece, please.
Follow us on Twitter. And we are also on Mastodon, and all of our other socials, as always, are going to be the show notes for you to find us, and you can chat with us there. Thank you all for listening so much. We'll see you in the next episode.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, I saw you missed it because you were eating, but I saw Saltburn.
How'd you think?
I think it's visually very pretty. The film looks very nice, obviously, and it is cast full of very attractive people. I gotta be honest, I didn't care for it really by the time I was done. Like, I understood the class narrative. I understood the sort of end goal of Barry Cogan's character, but after it was revealed that like he was just, I guess, spoilers for Saltburn, if this makes it into the edit, and you're listening to this episode recent to its release rather than 10 years from now or whatever. But when it's revealed that he was just trying to kind of kill off the family to become heir to Saltburn, it sort of invalidates a lot of the stuff that he did over the course of the film and turns it instead into just shock acting for the audience. Like, there's no reason for him to drink Jacob Elordi's bathwater.
Yeah.
Nor is there any reason for him to fuck his grave. There's not even really much of a reason for him to like have oral sex with his sister other than potentially to like make her kind of go a bit crazy. Like, it just reframes all of those things instead from him being like psychosexually obsessed with this guy to just, I'm doing this for the audience so that the audience can be shocked and have their minds blown by how daring this film is.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I was pretty disappointed by the end of it because I really liked Emerald Fennell's first film. I think Promising Young Woman's great. That's a film that has a shocking ending that I think completely works, other than some like movie contrivance sort of tropey stuff, but it doesn't invalidate the movie. Like, just the way that movie concludes is not the way that you're expecting it to. So I was expecting something similar from Saltburn, and I was pretty sad when it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Also, just like, sorry to cut you off. Like, the other thing that made me angry is for the first like 45 minutes of that movie, I was like, when are they gonna fuck? Like, when are they gonna finally kiss? Even Jacob Elordi's behavior doesn't make too much sense, because in that scene in the montage when they become friends at Oxford, he's sitting there with his hand on Barry Cogan's upper thigh. Like it's resting there, and he kisses him on the cheek before he gets up to take that girl home. And then like Barry Cogan watches them have sex from the bushes. Like, none of, like, it's so much just like audience teasing material to make you think it's going in a direction it isn't, and then it doesn't make any sense when it finally is done. It's so sad.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I oversold it, but that's very close to how I read the movie. I was hoping that the most generous read that I came up with for it is basically that it was an attempt to criticize the structures of class by saying that by basically doing like a Freudian psychoanalysis on status climbers.
Mm-hmm.
And I was hoping that someone else would be able to see that. And if you didn't see that, then it's probably not there.
I think that's a very charitable interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not, like, again, I think you pretty much have nailed it with the criticism. I just don't like to put those kinds of critical framings into people's heads before they go to see a movie, because I do think it's interesting, and I do think it's trying for something. I don't think it succeeds.
It absolutely is, which is actually the same thought that I had about Asteroid City. Did you see Asteroid City?
No, I didn't.
So I hated The French Dispatch.
Okay, huh.
I walked
out of that movie.
Yeah, like by the end of it, I was like, okay, cool. You really like the New York. Like, I'm glad this movie was a slog to get through, in my opinion. I really, really, really liked the story about the police chef and Jeffrey Wright's character. That's got like the level of humor that I have been kind of missing from Wes Anderson movies, and absurdity, and like I thought it mixed well with the camera work. But just, I could not have for the life of me described what was going on in the Timothée Chalamet vignette in the middle of the movie, the second one, and just thought that was largely just badly done and pointless and super slow. And while I enjoyed the first vignette, again, I just thought it was just so slow paced that I didn't see it in theaters. I was watching it on HBO Max, and I paused it and I was like, I'm only an hour into this movie. Like I could not believe that mentally. Um, so I did not love the French Dispatch, and so I saw Asteroid City because I'd heard a lot of good things about it. It was free on Amazon Prime, and it kind of seemed to be getting a lot of the praise that like Grand Budapest Hotel got, which is one of my favorite movies that Wes Anderson makes. But I kind of feel the same way as what you were saying with Saltburn, Will, in that it's very obvious that Wes Anderson was reaching for something with Asteroid City from a thematic perspective and was trying to like make a coherent point about where stories come from, the real life inspirations behind fiction, how he tells stories, what the life of storytellers or actors or writers are. But I feel like it fell apart in the last third because it just there's no, I feel like, coherence to what Wes Anderson's final point was. Like I didn't come away from that movie thinking like, oh, this is like a really intelligent description of like blah 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 or XYZ. And it was a real shame because it was really, really good for the 95% of the movie up until then.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen Asteroid City. I did hear just the other day I was listening to a podcast about Anderson's movies, where a big fan of his work said that it was one of the worst movies he'd ever seen. So,
Disagree.
well, so yeah, I'm curious to see the movie because I've heard such wildly differing opinions on it. I liked The French Dispatch, and I understand all of the issues everyone has with it. Because both of you are far from alone in not liking it. But I am all in on Wes Anderson's like pure formalist period. I'm all in on his desire to like make movies that have no plot and no character because he kind of sucks at it, and just lean 100% into like skewing the way that films are structured and built. I think I find that very interesting and very enjoyable. But it's also not why most people watch movies.
Like I agree. I agree with what you're talking about from a standpoint of like the way that he's kind of breaking down like the structures of films and everything. I disagree with the idea that he can't create like compelling characters or people, like, because so much of his earlier work is very earnest and has very good characters in it, like the three brothers in Darjeeling Limited.
Okay. But
like
the three brothers in Darjeeling Limited are just the guys in Bottle Rocket. And that's like they are all the same characters, and the stories are all the same when they're actually character-driven plots. The only one that doesn't do that really is the Grand Budapest Hotel, and then his animated stuff, which is of a different style entirely.
True. I think Grand Budapest Hotel is his best film.
Yeah, but Grand Budapest Hotel is also like essentially like a magnum opus in the traditional sense, in that it's recapitulating that desire in him to basically make art for the sake of being anti-totalitarian in basis rather than in effect. Like I think that that's a movie you can only really do the one time, and I'm not sure he has the conceptual backing to do it again.
Yeah, I mean he definitely got more than a healthy dose of help from Stefan Zweig as well.
Yeah,
it's fair. Yeah, I feel like he's always capable of more because he's done it in the past.
But I don't think he's capable of doing that outside of like the Rushmore or the Tenenbaum's structure. Like,
yeah, maybe not.
Because I don't find his characters compelling on their own. I find them compelling in ensemble, and it doesn't seem like he can do anything but rearrange the ensemble.
That's fair. I do wish that he'd stop getting A-listers to read their lines monotone. I would vastly prefer that. That was one thing that really stuck out to me about the French Dispatch, but even more so Asteroid City, is he has all these really top caliber actors, and he has all of them read their the same way, and it's just this very monotone, just delivery of information style. Like, what is the point here? Like, what are you trying to accomplish by this? I don't know. Like, why are you going to get Tom Hanks for this role if you're just going to have Tom Hanks read out his lines the exact same way you Jason out his 12 movies you've made?
Yeah, I mean that just all I can think when I hear that is just, it's just kind of a middle finger to expectation, which is not engaging, not fun in and of itself. I, find some perverse delight in that attitude, but that doesn't make it.
Yeah, I guess if you're talking about it from a standpoint of it being engaging due to the sort of breaking down the format or construction of film, I can see what you mean. So essentially, what we were saying is that Wes Anderson, the Hollywood equivalent of what Craig Ferguson did with the Late Late Show. He broke down the late night show format and its structure and content.
I am too young to actually be able to engage with that.
Oh, that's so sad. Craig Ferguson's Late Late Show was genius.
Yeah, I've heard that, but it's one of those things where it happened before I was born, and so like thinking about, like, okay, when I imagine Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, I just think of essentially like the most stilted, most parodic thing I can imagine. I basically imagine the Larry Sanders Show, but like less hip somehow. So it is hard for me to even put myself in the frame of mind in which the late night show format is subvertible, I guess, because I grew up with Eric Andre being in.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. When you first started saying that statement, I was like, he's not that young. The Late Late Show started in 2005.
Yeah, and I was, under 10. The late night show format doesn't really work for children.
Yeah, I guess not. Suppose we should get back to talking about Chapter 11, huh?
Yeah.
Probably.
Okay. Nixon's presence in a lot of postmodern literature is something that I find, from that quote to his presence, in this book, to the entirety of Public Burning. Like, he's such a comical character in American history that it's hard not to find room to point fun at him or just point out the absurdity of who he was as a character. You can't, I feel like, do the same with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan seemed like an earnestly evil guy, whereas Nixon seemed a lot more, a misguided fool, or potentially just a victim of his own narcissism.
I think that might be the most controversial thing anyone has said on this show.
It's possible. It's like Nixon's not a good guy, but I don't know. I find him less sinister than Ronald Reagan, certainly.
The way I view Reagan as sinister is in the same way that I would view an automaton as sinister.
Yeah.
Whereas Nixon, you're right. He is more humanly so, but I find that more threatening personally, because at least the automaton won't like kill you for flipping him off. They'll just like laugh and wave, which is, in some ways more dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Less scary though, personally.
Yeah. It's just an absurd person. Like him trying to deny all of the stuff in the Nixon tapes that was leaked, or him trying to redact it, saying Nixon can't be seen, making these comments when he was reading a transcript of them. And also, his references to himself in the third person. Like, it's just so much about him is just so I don't even necessarily like humanly evil, yeah, but also just almost cartoonishly evil. Like he's such a caricature of like an unstable politician. Which is so funny, especially when you take into account his weird strategy to make people think that he was unstable. Maybe he wasn't so much of a performance. Anyway, we're getting way off topic.
Just a little bit.
But
This is a complete aside, and maybe should go at the end of the episode or something. But I did look up the word xanthocroid, and it for the listeners who didn't look it up, it means like a white, pale skinned blonde person. And there's a metal band called Xanthocroid, which like I mean with metal, and like I'm not saying all metal is like this, obviously, but there is kind of a white supremacist, white nationalist kind of undercurrent to some metal bands. Just struck me as problematic to name a metal band Xanthocroid.
No, if Xanthocroid is like an all-black metal band, it's actually kind of a rockin' name.
I'm pretty sure it's all white guys, but yeah,
I'm looking
right.
at it now. There's a woman,
okay.
and there's what appear to be 3 guys. Only one of them is blonde though, and it's not the woman. One of the guys is blonde, which I find kind of funny.
Yeah, and I mean it's if you don't look up the meaning of the word, it does sound kind of like a badass band name. Like it's not a bad band
It
name if you don't know the
does.
meaning of the word.
Hang on a second. Let me look them up on the Encyclopedia Metallum. Oh, they're black metal, which
That's a good start.
does not bode well for whether or not they have racist undertones. I'm not gonna pass any judgment. I don't know this band, but using what could be very easily used as a white supremacist term, and you're making what the Metal Archive says cinematic black metal. It's not the greatest comparison of ideas.
It might be a joke. If it's a joke,
Hopefully.
it's probably okay.
I would love to live in a world where Xanthocroid is an all black metal band. That'd be really funny. Like Joel Edgerton is pretty much great in everything he's in. Very rare
I
that
do like him.
Yeah. Very rare that like a movie he's in is bad. And even if the movie's bad, his performance is usually pretty good. He's in this weird movie called The Gift. That was the directorial debut of Jason Bateman. And I wish I could remember the ultimate like plot point that it was working towards with like the conclusion of the film. I can't remember what it is now, but like Joel Edgerton plays this super creepy, like not necessarily incel, but like outcast loner guy from the same high school that Jason Bateman's character went to, and has engineered the circumstances to live in the house next to Jason Bateman and his wife, and is regularly coming over like every day or regularly to deliver them gifts or leave them gifts. And each of them, it's one of those movies where like each aspect of his like plan feeds into his larger overall position and like the narrative revelation that it's obviously pointing towards. One of those movies. But the movie itself I just found super weird and like I don't know if I would say corny, but like it is taking itself like way too seriously for the kind of plot that it is, and the fact that this guy isn't just like delivering gifts in like the creepy like thriller sense, but he's taking the time to like wrap them in really fancy wrapping paper and do like these intense, like very stereotypical Christmas present bows in like contrasting color. Like the amount of time this man is taking to plan these weird gifts he's leaving on their doorstep is completely out of tone for the rest of the movie. But Joel Edgerton takes the material seriously and somehow like elevates it rather than allowing the shittiness of the film that he's in or the preposterous nature of the film that he's in to like drag him down. He's one of those like character actors who I find has a tendency to do that in the things that they're in. Like him and Scoot McNairy would be another one that I'd point to.
I'm sorry, my eating was delayed when I heard such a hot take as Jared Harris is a good actor.
He is a good actor.
No, he is fantastic.
Maybe not so much in the Mission Impossible movies, but
Oh, but nobody really is in those.
yeah,
settings.
that's true. I'm pretty sure everyone in the Mission Impossible movies is a caricature.
Well, and you forgot to mention Joel Edgerton's most important role, Owen
Mhm.
Lars in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith.
That's right. Yep. Without him, where would Anakin or Luke Skywalker have ended up? And they had to dig him up for that Obi-Wan show, like decades after the tiniest part he'd probably ever played.
I mean, you do. I imagine if they bring you back for that, they throw you like 0.01% residuals or something,
Yeah, probably.
which is probably more money than we can even imagine. Or maybe like a
For
meal
Star
a day.
Wars, it's definitely possible for Star Wars.
I would bet that Disney wouldn't give that much money to such a small role. That's my only intuition there.
Totally fair. I think, unironically, I think his best role was the main character in It Comes at Night. That would be my nomination for his best role.
Not heard of that one, honestly.
Oh my god, it's so good. It's an early A24 movie from like before the days where A24 was a brand and instead was just like an interesting film studio. And it is like a post-apocalyptic movie that is about this family that descends into, I guess I'll say, collateral murder because they get in a disagreement over who may have left a door open. Like it's so, and I realize that sounds more absurd than interesting, but like it is so effective in setting up this like world where the world has obviously ended without ever explaining to you how it ended or like the circumstances that led to the apocalypse or anything like that. It's just, you just know that it's over based on context clues and that there might be some sort of like virus or monster or zombie thing, but it's never totally clear if it's real or what it is. But there may be some kind of like disease that is transmissible. And this family lives in this sort of cabin or lodge, like out in the middle of a forest somewhere. I don't think it's ever made clear like what continent or what country or anything like that. And one day this other family is passing through and gets lost. I believe their car loses gas, and then they're wandering around in the forest until they end up like running into the cabin that the main family lives in. And there's this red door that they constantly set up over the course of the film is like that red door, when that's locked, like nobody goes out at night. You don't go out at night. The red door is sort of like the barrier that you don't cross. And then one night something happens and the door gets left open, and the rest of the film is the various characters dealing with the fallout of the circumstances of like who left the door open, why did they open the door, did they go outside, is somebody infected with something, are we all infected with something, like is this whole thing just a, and it spirals out from there, like is this whole meeting between the two families like a coincidence? And it just, all of the characters in the film sort of descend into paranoia, and as they sort of begin to kill each other off, the truth behind what actually happened becomes more obfuscated, and like less important, and then eventually like it has one of the most chilling final like shots of a movie that I've seen, with just the implications of sort of what you've watched over the past hour or so. It's so good. It's so good. Obliterature, if you listen to this show, and I feel like there's a solid chance that you actually do, bring back your t-shirts. Those were so good.